Students and teachers of the post-pandemic world, what was your best hot mic story during virtual learning? I had to defend my thesis over Zoom, and many professors came into the call to watch. My thesis was about immune response in fish to parasites. One professor joined late and forgot to mute her mic, and we got treated to this little gem. Shh, Mommy is learning about fish parasites, which is what you'll get if you don't stop peeing in the koi pond. We overheard a girl's mum saying, "Who the frick are you on the computer for this early in the morning?" and asking the same thing over and over. The teacher piped in, "I think your mic is on." This is the one thing I didn't sign up for as a teacher. I'd be doing office hours for one or the other conferences with students, and their parents would be screaming at them to stop playing games and messing around and come downstairs to do X, Y, or Z. One father shoulder rushed into the student's room to scream about a dirty mug that was in the sink, and then started screaming questions about who they were talking to and was this an online whoopee thing. Your kid is 20 and taking college classes and trapped at home because the dorms are shut. Get out, Dad. An English class Zoom call. The teacher was holding us about 15 minutes after the period had ended. She said something along the lines of, "Keep working arduously," and I responded with, "If she says arduously one more time, I'm going to flip a table." Apparently, I wasn't on mute. I did 8-hour Zoom calls for 7 weeks training for a new project. On the second week, a man unmuted his call, expelled the longest, loudest butt gas emission I've ever heard in my life, then when he finishes, mutes the call. I can see others laughing while muted at his fatal error of thinking he wasn't muted, and so he went to mute his call during the emission. I found this to be the highlight of the week, but then the following week the guy did it again. Honestly, the second time I laughed, but then started to wonder if it was some kind of power move. Not really anything super weird. I was in a meeting with my class for the first day of school, and I'd forgotten to mute myself. I then proceeded to start noisily baby-talking my cat, who was in my lap at the time. Embarrassing. I mean, I have to assume that at least some of the people on the call appreciated the cat, so you're probably only thought of as an abject maniac by most of them. I still love the idea of a teacher being interrupted by, "Yo, Mr. Chips, who's a chubby little cutie? You are. No, you are." This is from a couple of years ago. I was working for a private college which has several campuses. My campus was the online campus. Each year the campuses took turns hosting an annual writing conference for the English and speech faculty. With it being the online campus's turn to host, we came up with the idea to make it a virtual conference which faculty members could attend from home or go to their own campus and attend with their peers in a classroom. Anyway, as one of the people on the conference committee, my job was to host several of the various breakout sessions, make sure the WebEx meeting was working, introduce the presenter of the session, monitor the Q&A, and stuff like that. I also made sure to mute the participants once it was time for the speaker to start. So this was a no live mic scenario, but one of the participants left his webcam on. During the presentation, he whips out a gigantic party sub and is just going to town on it. So while everyone's watching the presenter's PowerPoint, you can just see this guy, who I'd met before and was legit 6'8", just scarfing down a party sub in a window in the bottom of the screen. Honestly, it was more impressive than anything. In one of my classes, the girl wrote in the Zoom chat, "This is so freaking boring," not realizing that the professor could see it. In a math class I was in last year, we were taking a test which you have to turn on your mic for, their way of trying to prevent cheating. Some girl apparently forgot that hers was on and started belting out "Stand By You" by Rachel Platten at the top of her lungs. It went on for the entire song and she was still humming it when I finished the test and left the call. My sweet old Russian professor had us do the same thing for our final. At one point, text-to-speech for Google Translate goes off saying, 2011, which was one of the years we had to translate into Russian. The girl got away with it by saying, "Oh, sorry, Siri went off for some reason." I teach for an online university that requires me to conduct a weekly live session. One morning I was lecturing and a student popped in a bit late. I said, "Hello, student name. Thanks for joining us." She said, "Don't say my name, B-word," just before she realized her mic was on and turned it off. I just laughed. Grade 3 kid stopped in the middle of the class meeting and took his laptop into the bathroom with him and sat on the toilet for the rest of the meeting. I was producing a video for some university professors on a specific medical thing for a virtual learning course. I was all set up to shoot the process, and the teachers excused themselves to the next office to regroup and have a chat. I already had their wireless lav mics attached and fed to my camera, So when I sat down at the camera and put on my headphones, I immediately heard their conversation. They were criticizing me, saying they couldn't believe they hired someone so young, inexperienced in that particular medical field, how I looked, how I asked questions. Whoops! At least I made them a fine video. These days I don't put on my headphones until we're about to shoot. Last week, a kid in my brother's class forgot his camera was on during the first class and was smoking out of a giant glass pipe during the syllabus review. Ironically, my IT teacher forgot to turn off his mic and camera and proceeded to get in a very heated argument on the phone with his ex-girlfriend, who he has a kid with. Did I mention he's also a teacher at our school? Yeah, the most awkward 5 minutes of my life before he realized. During my English class, this one girl forgot to mute herself. While my teacher was talking, she almost deafened all of us on the Zoom call answering her mother's questions. We heard her mum yelling from a distance, "What class are you in?" "English!" "Oh, the hot teacher?" "Yeah, that guy." Now, even I'll admit my teacher is fairly attractive, but it does take it to another level when you get your own mother involved. Thankfully, our teacher is a chill guy and thought the whole thing was just kind of funny, and just kind of gave a general reminder to the class to keep mics muted. That girl didn't say anything for the rest of the class. I heard the smacking sound of a kid whacking the mule. His name lit up and everything. Look, everyone does that in their own time, and you couldn't see him doing it, but there is just such a profound sense of disgust just knowing that it's happening, isn't there? Either that or he was tenderizing a joint of meat with a mallet. You never know. Dude, my one teacher forgot to turn off his camera and his son was changing in the background, and the son kept looking straight at us through the camera. I remember a similar question where a mom answered that she was taking a Zoom call in the garden until a coworker mentioned that there was a kid skateboarding behind her in his birthday suit. In a thermodynamics class, one of the students said, "Holy crap, this is so much," after covering a large set of equations related to fugacity. Everyone found it relatable. One of my professor's classes had a student say something like, "I just joined 5 minutes before class and this jerk is already teaching." The professor just laughed and told him his mic was on. A student in my class forgot to turn off their mic and we heard some background noises, doors closing, tapping, and because of a display bug, we couldn't see where the noise was from. Then the student started saying crap about the teacher. "Oh yeah, this is useless. He's just writing on a tablet. Even I could do that." Everyone heard that. The teacher heard them just insult him. That kid didn't come back to the classes after that. We had a student in my class that was logged in on a smartphone using an anonymous login who never muted their mic once. They were outside or near a window every time. When their mic picked up a sound, it would maximize their blank screen, minimizing the teacher's lesson, which was on a whiteboard. It happened a lot. The teacher didn't know who it was, and despite all of us begging them to mute, they never responded or did so, and the teacher wasn't able to mute or boot them. The worst part is, since they were connected anonymously, they never even got recorded as attending the lectures, and failed for that reason alone. All of us suffered for this one jerk who failed anyway. I was in training before classes started this year, 200-ish teachers. Only principal and the assistant principal were speaking. A teacher has her mic unmuted, the phone rings, she picks it up and says, "Hey, yeah, just sitting here in another one of these goddamn trainings." I'm a college student. Last year we had a girl place an entire dinner order over the phone with her mic on while we all tried to tell her that her mic was in fact on. I think she had us muted. She was ordering Mediterranean food. I think she got a chicken gyro. I feel like I ought to mention she was also yelling across the house to ask her mum what she wanted from wherever they were ordering from. Sadly, we didn't get to hear the mum's order. Someone in my class forgot to turn off the mic and started singing along to a song, and loudly. Someone told her, and there was this odd whoop noise, and then she cut off. I'm not a student, but I work in the tech industry. I've been in meetings where people forget to mute themselves on large company calls with hundreds of thousands of attendees, and we'll hear a fart noise and then a toilet flush sometimes. That's about as interesting as those meetings get, though. I had a student's boyfriend, they were both in college, walk up behind her on Zoom, reach into her shirt, pull out her chest bits, and start doing a little bounce around with them. She was just laughing and playfully slapping his hands away. This was probably 30 seconds after I'd just gone through my whole speech of making sure there was nothing in your browser history, Google search history, or names of folders that could be embarrassing or offensive. College student here. This was autumn 2020, so it's when we'd first switched to all online. I had an 8 a.m. class that was Renaissance through modern art history. Anyway, this one kid in the class didn't have his mic muted and he was snoring. Like snoring. My poor professor tried to wake him up and she couldn't. She also had no idea how to mute him or kick him, so we went on with the lecture. After about 5 minutes, she finally said, "I can't frickin' teach to this," and ended the Zoom meeting. You can submit your own stories to be featured here on the channel. The story submission link is in the description below, and if you want to listen to some vibey music in the background, check out easymode, also linked below, and subscribe. Not on Zoom, but when I was a flight attendant, we used handheld microphones to give briefings and make announcements. One female passenger got in my friend's face and screamed at her that if her bags were lost, or if her golf bag was damaged, she'd make sure to hold her personally responsible. My friend was pretty shaken not only by the loudness and anger, but by the woman's spittle, and tried to hold it together to give her her departure briefing. Anyway, her hot mic moment was as follows. "Welcome aboard flight number, service to Orlando, you frickin' B-word." The entire plane just lost it. My friend had forgotten to let go of the keys on the side of the mic, so all of the noise was picked up. During a virtual gym class for my high school, a girl forgot to mute herself during a workout and yelled some obscene things very loudly. In one of my online classes, a friend of mine Facebook stalked a cute guy from their tutorial before realizing she was still screen sharing. Stalk on your separate devices, folks. Honestly, the risk of this alone happening is enough to make me stay the hell off social media while I've been on Zoom meetings my whole life. My son calls his tablet his fix because when I first got it and the battery would die, I'd tell him I was going to fix it. So imagine his pre-kindergarten teacher's surprise last spring when he asked me if he could have his fix now that he was done with school. I cracked up and held up the fix in question and explained what he meant. Someone posted a drawing of a Hello Kitty type character on the side of their presentation during a virtual meeting. One of my coworkers mumbled, "Damn, it's got a fat butt." Which, when I looked again, yeah, the character did have a pear body shape. It was a weird thing for someone to say though. My brain just dismissed it as me mishearing it, until they panicked a second later and apologized for not being on mute. And then I fully processed it. Additional context, the mumbler is a 50-year-old mother of 3. It wasn't too bad, but during the graduating ceremony for a class, all the staff were asked to attend and turn on their mics to clap at certain points, so it wouldn't be awkward. One such staff member forgot to turn their mic back on and was loudly, jokingly insulting their husband and asking for another drink while complaining about how long and boring this was. This was broadcast to the whole class, their parents, and anyone else listening. We stuck together and didn't tell anyone who it was, but we all knew. Mute your mics. One time in an art class, separate from my school, my dad knocked on my door. It was dead silent at that point, everyone was working on their projects. I clicked the mute button and yelled, "What?" Turns out my mic was already muted and I'd turned it on. I startled the entire class and the teacher asked if I was okay. Not virtual, but a few years back my roommate was in a chemistry lecture and the professor excused himself and left the room, but left the wireless mic on. He proceeded to vent gas loudly and came back into the lecture hall to see all of his students dying of laughter. So we were making our classes as a phone call on an app called TeamSpeak, I think. Anyways, I was using my phone to talk and my computer to work on and sometimes check Discord. At one point, we were supposed to do some exercise on our own, and I left my mic on. My friend sends me a message talking about the fact that he got a girlfriend. So I send him, "You did it, you crazy son of a witch." Then I wanted to add an emoji, so I tried to edit the message and I hit the text-to-speech button instead. The computer literally yelled, "You crazy son of a witch." And obviously, witch was spelt with a B at the start instead of a W. I was visiting my best friend during a lecture and she had her mic and video turned off. She then had to join a group discussion and sometimes unmuted herself to contribute something. After that, the whole class was supposed to present their results, and she supposedly muted herself again. I started venting to her how wasps are considered wild bees even though they have no business being bees because they're jerks, and suddenly we hear laughter from her professor and her classmates. Oops, she forgot to mute herself. We recently had a meeting with our whole team where the host forgot to turn off screen sharing. So, we all saw him respond positively to a job offer. Funniest thing I've ever seen. Or it would be if the offer hadn't included the salary, letting us all know that this grossly incompetent worker was getting paid way more than the rest of us. Still, we were just glad to see him go. This was a conference call for work, but it was a big call with something like 12 people, and I was new, so I was really just listening as the senior analysts were discussing something. The call was going on for a while, so I took my laptop into the bathroom with me to take a number 2, flushed the toilet, and everyone just stopped talking. Turns out I didn't mute my mic, and everyone just heard a toilet flushing in the middle of the meeting. Luckily, no one cared and they all laughed about it, but I was mortified. I wonder what else they heard. A student's mother had the habit of standing just off camera and very closely observing her kid. I know this because one time the student forgot to disable the mic. Everyone heard how the mother was coaching the student how to act. Don't look my way, smile, pay attention. It was next-level helicoptering. Bad parenting in my opinion. Our school has a good counselor and the student is getting help. All the teachers had been advised to limit contact with the mother and not make waves, lest she withdraw the student or redouble her controlling behavior. I worry about it constantly. Well, you know that feature of pressing the spacebar to talk? Well, someone in my class was too used to pressing the spacebar to pause a video and mistakenly pressed it to pause the class to speak to someone in their home, but would instead say nonsense while the teacher was speaking, and this happened multiple times. While giving a lecture on the heated arguments among different schools of psychology, our professor screamed, "Fire! There's a fire!" And most of the confused students, including the teacher's pets, replied, "I agree, those were some lit points." Things turned out funnier and scarier when the professor went on with the screaming, and we could hear her calling the rest of her house for help, and then their brother joining the chorus of "Fire" sparking up her switchboard. So yeah, a confused, concerned class of 50 sat through an entire episode of "Put Out the Fire" while our professor revealed every dynamic of their family through her freaked-out screams. 30 minutes later, she came back to her laptop to unmute herself, only to find 100 "Are you okay?" texts in the chat box. Given how fried some of our brains were in the pandemic, if someone shouted fire during one of my team meetings, I'm not entirely certain I wouldn't have sprinted out of my apartment and halfway down the street before I realized I was in fact not in danger. You seem like a nice class, though. During one of the lectures, our cat came into the room and jumped onto my lap. I proceeded to tell him how very cute he is and how much I love him in the stupidly sweetest voice possible because he is, in fact, the best boy. Then, a full minute or two into me praising the cat, a message popped up from my classmate saying I was unmuted. I had a mini spook and I replied with, "Oh, I was just talking to him," and sent a picture of the cat. It was extra awkward because I walk around with a resting angry face and barely talk to anyone when we're at uni. So my classmate later admitted that the only reason no one warned me sooner was because it didn't occur to them that that person with this sweet voice was in fact me. The president of the university I attended until 2007 was presenting something with a bunch of other important people. This was being recorded for later upload and right when the pandemic was starting, around March 2020. His wife appeared in the middle of the talk, mad as hell, telling him to go clean the toilet and that she's not his servant to clean his stuff. A few very awkward seconds later, he just says, "Maybe we have to go edit this out later." Now imagine how viral this must have been. I haven't had any ties to the university since 2007, yet somehow that video got onto my WhatsApp. I remember once during English class I forgot to turn off my mic. So obviously I was browsing Reddit during class and giving out low laughs to memes, and everyone could hear me. Didn't stop until the teacher asked what was so funny. An elementary student left the room with their camera on for a moment and the mother walked by completely undressed. I'm guessing that she asked him to leave the room so she could change or something, not realizing the camera was in fact still going. This particular teacher was going through a rough time and the class could feel it. We assured her that we had done our homework and that she could take a rest for the time being. She agreed and told us she'd switch her mic off and sleep for a while as we did whatever. Her husband was right beside her and the mic was not turned off. She told him, "I'm so lucky to have these students," and started sobbing to her husband. We all heard this, but kept quiet to prevent her from being embarrassed. She slept well during that time, and we sent her a thank you gift collectively. I had a student give a very sarcastic response to a question I asked, and before I could respond, his mum started chewing into him and whacking him with a chunkler. His mic and video were on the whole time. For those asking, I didn't report the mother who took time off from her only remaining job during a pandemic so she could make sure her sons were able to access their education. Didn't strike me as awful parenting. I did call her after school to talk and let her know I'd keep her updated on how her son was doing during class, so hopefully, between the two of us, we could keep him out of trouble. And some of you clearly didn't grow up around Hispanic families. La chancla is part of the culture. I'm a student and my teacher was talking to his wife at first. Pretty normal, right? Well, she leaves, and then he gets on the phone and says, "Yeah, sweetie, my wife just left. Want to come over?" The entire class went bat-crap insane. My college class got to hear me tell my dog about what a good boy he was. I'm a tutor, and my student forgot to mute themselves before leaving for a 5-minute break. She had a beautiful conversation with her brother about how much of a C-word I was, how much I sucked, and how poor I and my house look. Luckily, I always record my tutoring sessions, so I finished as if nothing happened, sent the clip straight to my supervisor, and the student got booted off the tutoring program, as I'm the only tutor advanced enough for her grade that's able to take her. Someone in our science class didn't realize he was unmuted and called a widely disliked kid the N-word with a hard R. Somehow, he didn't even get in trouble, though. I asked a question on Zoom for someone, and he didn't answer. He had no video on. I asked again to confirm he was there, and silence. Hello? Then he panics and says, "Sorry, I'm peeing." Did I need to know that? No, I didn't. What's the cringiest thing you've seen a bride and groom do for their wedding? At a classmate's wedding, they were young, maybe like 22 or 23, there's apparently a caking tradition in some parts of the country where they cut the wedding cake and the couple feed each other a bit and smear each other's faces with cake as a joke. The bride had made it 1,000% clear to the groom she did not want to be caked. And he did it anyways. Not just a little smear, but full-on smushed the slice in her face. She was stunned initially, and then got up, face full of cake, and yelled, "You butthole! I told you not to do that!" Then ran to the back area in reception. The groom tried to follow, but the bridesmaids and mother of the bride stopped him dead. So he sat at the head table awkwardly while half the wedding party rushed off with the bride. She stayed back there for like an hour. They eventually did let him back there to check on her, and we could hear her crying and them arguing. The rest of the reception came to a screeching halt until one of the bride's aunts emerged and directed the servers to clear the tables and put on some music. They got divorced 2 years later. The bride showed up almost 2 hours late to her own wedding. Southern California in an open field, no water and no shade. She shows up and wants to get married in her yoga outfit, and the groom shuts this down, and when she refuses to change her clothes, the groom decides to leave her looking stupid and they never got married. I've now spoken with my uncle, and it turns out he had speculation that his fiancée was sleeping with her personal trainer. When she showed up in her yoga outfit, it was all he needed to call off the wedding. She ended up married to her personal trainer and divorced again. The groom gave a speech thanking everyone for coming that devolved in the space of about 2 minutes into a straight-up roast of his new brother-in-law. They were friends, and the brother-in-law seemed to take it in good humor, but there's only so much implication of, "I'm gonna be railing your sister tonight," that you can take before it becomes really cringy. It didn't help that A, I barely knew anyone there because I was a +1, and B, I was on the table with the elderly relatives from that side of the family who were less than amused. They sang their vows to each other. Neither of them had a singing voice. The vows were generally bat-crap crazy, like being submissive in the bedroom and not asking about where she was going. The auto-tune microphones were a terrible idea. Their vow songs shared a chorus, and it was awful, and they expected the guests to sing along with the chorus. And the vow singing lasted 20 minutes. Pure cringe. Look, I can deal with most of that as it's their special day and we need to facilitate them as much, if not more than they facilitate their guests on the day, and I'll even try to smile and gag on the truth as I tell you how wonderful it was, but the point where you lose me is the 20 frickin' minutes. That's absolutely horrific. I wasn't a guest, I was just working the wedding. The bride got drunk and sat on some other guy's lap for 2 hours and flirted with him while the groom sat by himself at the head table with a defeated look on his face. Does dying on the inside count regarding the "until death do us part" clause? Because he might have an out that way. They invited all their friends and expected 700 people, and like less than 100 showed up. This one wasn't the bride and groom's fault, but the pastor marrying them talked about his marriage and his kids for 20 minutes. He was obviously going for something and showing what marriage will be like, but he went on talking about his daughter Kelsey learned to walk this way and his other daughter's first words were this and that he and his wife made love throughout the house because that's what you do when you're in love. The bride and the groom had to stand there holding hands for 20 minutes right in front of him as the other 150 of us had to listen about his bedroom life and his kids. The groom sang his vows. I honestly had to stare at the floor and slow breathe to not laugh and get through it. Okay, I'd forgotten about this because it was like 25 years ago, but I went to a wedding where the bride did something similar. The thing was, she was so nervous she actually chucked up before singing her song, right there at the front of the church. Luckily, she had moved off to the side to sing. They'd set up a little separate stage there. So she blew chunks, sang her song, someone ran in and cleaned it up pretty quickly, and then they did the vows. The funny part is we'd all kind of moved on and didn't think about it during the ceremony at all, which went really well until the kiss. And then the whole crowd groaned in unison. They bought an apple orchard after leaving the city for a simpler life, and really doubled down on the apple theme for the wedding. Apples everywhere, on the tables, in baskets, all around the venue, on the podium where they got married, pictures of apples hanging everywhere, small fake trees with apples tossed under them. The guy marrying them had an apple tie on, apples somehow incorporated into every dish for the reception, and the cake was shaped like an apple. It was really frickin' bizarre. They sold the orchard a couple of years later because they had no idea what they were doing with the place. When I was in high school, one of my hockey teammates had a kid with his girlfriend when they were juniors. They decided to get married, and the wedding was officiated by my teammate's dad, who also happened to be our head coach. The entire wedding was the bride and groom's direct family and the hockey team at a Golden Corral. Then the reception was at the same Golden Corral. Then we had a hockey game that night. The other team we played that night somehow found out about it and hounded the guy the whole time. They were a bunch of jerks. An acquaintance I knew where the pastor marrying them told the couple to divorce their friends under the promise that it would make them a stronger couple or some crap like that. And they followed that advice. So pretty much after the wedding and reception, they just never again talked to any of the friends they'd invited to celebrate their big moment. I thought they'd be divorced within a year, but turns out they're still together. But yeah, apparently married couples aren't allowed to have friends? I've worked over 200 weddings at the same venue. Many couples wanted fireworks, and we had a company that would always do a show. The couple always, without fail, would pick Firework by Katy Perry to play during the show. The ceremony was also the name reveal. They changed their last name because they didn't want to be stuck to their heritage and didn't want anything to hold them back. Turns out they changed their name thinking they could erase their mountains of debt or at least hide from it. Turns out you can't live under two legal identities. Oh, I have two. First, the bride decided to sing as she walked down the aisle. She wasn't a particularly talented singer, and she was singing over a Carrie Underwood song so we could all hear the original vocal track. She finished walking about halfway through the song, and then stood there and sang the rest of the song at the groom, and all we could do was sit there and watch. And the second? Well, at a different wedding, they began the wedding with the groom playing an out-of-tune guitar and singing to the bride. They were sitting on chairs in front of everyone, legit 400 people, and the bride was clearly uncomfortable, which made everyone else uncomfortable. That wedding also included a foot-washing ceremony, and when the bride put her shoes back on, she tripped on her dress and fell flat on her face. They hadn't done the vows yet, and the ceremony stopped for 20 minutes to deal with the nosebleed that she had given herself. Man, there's a surprising amount of weddings where the couples in question just decide that they're going to take advantage of everyone's goodwill and become musical stars for one day, huh? Gotta respect the drive, even if it sounds like the ones that do this really can't sing and seem to carry it on for a tortuous amount of time. 20 minutes seems to be the average. Bride takes 3 hours to appear. After the ceremony, she and her spouse go up in an air balloon, and that marriage did not last a year. My cousin and his wife are super religious and may be the two most awkward people I've ever met. They did one of those fake-out first dances where it starts with a slow song and then transitions to a dance number with an upbeat song. Not only is that naturally cringeworthy, the upbeat song was 5 minutes long, and they just kept repeating the same moves over and over for what felt like an eternity. There was no booze allowed at the wedding, so there was nothing to dull the pain. Flew away in a helicopter at the end, but there were only appetizers for food. My own wedding. My brother and our wedding band surprised us with a beautiful rendition of a very romantic song by a guy called Juan Luis Guerra, and it just so happened to be me and the missus's favorite song ever. Lots of happy crying and one of the best memories from that day. Unfortunately, my mother-in-law doesn't like to be one-upped, so she impromptu just got a distant second cousin from her side of the family who we didn't know to immediately sing My Heart Will Go On from Titanic. He was not a good singer and used a crappy YouTube karaoke track, and it led to a very awkward, slow dancing, followed by fuming from my mother-in-law after we cut it short. Terrible feedback from trying to play the track on the mic from the phone speaker. It just completely deflated the beautiful moment from my brother's singing. At least I'm happy to say we're still going strong and have been married for 10 years now. It should go without saying that little poop nugget of singing was not included in our wedding video. Imagine not refusing to go sing in this situation. The mother-in-law must have threatened the second cousin with something real good. The groomsmen prepared a skit in which they lost the groom at the reception and proceeded with over-the-top, hands-on-hips, one guy saying in the fakest cartoony voice, "Hey, aren't we missing something? It can't be me because I'm always prepared." Winks and pauses for laughs. "What about your bow tie?" "Oh no!" Produces tie, puts it on, waits for audience reaction. "No, wait, it's the groom. Where could he possibly be?" Acting like some High School Musical crap. None of the guests were prepared and silently fussed around with their drinks and silverware. This went on for a bit. I don't remember it at all because I was on my phone, not really doing anything but avoiding eye contact every time they said a line and desperately scanned across the audience. When the whole thing ended, they anticipated like a standing ovation, but it went over the heads of everyone. A lone voice muttered, "Well, that was kinda weird," and the thespians made their exit quietly. The groom came out through the door when he was cued shortly afterwards. I don't think he knew about the skit. Thank God he wasn't there to see it unfold. As for the crowd, who isn't going to clap and whistle when the newlyweds show up at a wedding, so it was all good. You can submit your own stories to be featured here on the channel. The story submission link is in the description below. And if you want to listen to some vibey music in the background, check out easymode, also linked below, and subscribe. Oh, friends of friends. Young, uber-Christian, small-town naive girl meets married, much older man with 2 kids. Falls in love, and he does eventually leave his wife. Doesn't want any custody. The wedding was her hometown church. His vows were over the top about how he's never felt love before. She's the only woman he ever wanted to marry. He's been so lonely his whole life. He's literally sobbing through it all. Her turn to say her vows, and she's standing there saying nothing for at least 3 beats. Then she's handed a microphone and the piano starts playing. She's made up her own song, which are her vows. After the ceremony, we adjourn to the church basement for the alcohol-free reception, and I'm somehow roped into serving the groom's cake. It's 2 NASCAR car cakes made with an edible photo draped over the cake shapes and is impossible to cut through without mangling the cake, so I have to peel that photo off. My friend is cutting the bride's cake, and it's a full inch or more of fondant on top of plain cake. No frosting. The buffet was potluck from her family. Food you'd expect at a kid's party. Pink punch was the only thing to drink. No dancing because of her religion. Then they left in a 2-horse-drawn carriage for their honeymoon at the town's only hotel, which was like a Motel 6-level dump. Dated a girl in my 20s and went to her friend's wedding in upstate New York. In the middle of the service, the minister's cell phone rang, and he answered it. It was God. God wanted to talk to the groom. The conversation lasted a couple of minutes, and then the ceremony continued. Instead of throwing rice or confetti or just sprinkles or anything like that, the bride and the groom asked their friends to save all their empty Yule pods and throw those as they walked down the aisle. The friends obliged. "Please chuck garbage at us as we leave the church. Sure sets the tone for the marriage." At the beginning of the reception, we all had to stand up and sing the national anthem. To be clear, this was another country I'd never been to a wedding in before, so I thought, okay, maybe this is just a tradition I've never heard of before. Then I told this to other people and they were all like, no, it's just really weird. Also, at that wedding, the father of the groom ended his speech with what I'm sure he thought was an amazing joke on how it's easier to build a bridge to Hawaii than to understand what a woman is thinking. It would have been awkward enough had the man also not been standing between his ex and current wife as he was delivering it. I was at a wedding when I was 8, and instead of the bride and groom getting up to make their speech thanking everyone, they'd done it like an awards show. So the DJ opened an envelope, announced their names, and they were handed an awards statue, a Barbie and Ken doll, and proceeded to thank everyone in the form of an awards speech. In the right hands, it might have been funny, but the bride and groom are incredibly shy by nature, so it was just awkward. I'm in my 30s now, and I still remember this. My wife and I don't dance, so we hadn't danced together before our wedding dance. Loved it, but it was probably cringeworthy from the outside. I know a guy who recently made his lackeys, friends, compete to be his best man. The most pretentious thing I've ever seen. Watching them grovel was so upsetting to me. If it's just to get out of the agony of that decision, I could maybe understand, but then again, this implies that they're giving him gifts or doing things to demonstrate their friendship, which is honestly just a gross thing to do to your friends. If someone announced this, I'd probably just tell them that I'd see them at the wedding and enjoy not having to come up with a speech for the absolute idiot. I went to a wedding once where they did a potluck. I guess it's okay depending on the type of wedding, but the reception was at a fairly nice venue, the wedding couple was like an hour and a half late, and the best man didn't have a speech ready to go, so it went on for a very painful 15 to 25 minutes. Also stating in there that they're going to have great bedroom fun times now that they're married. This was a devout Christian wedding with many of the friends, including me, from the church. By the time we got back to the table to eat, I was lucky if I'd got something that was kept warm in a crock pot, but everything else was room temperature. We were able to go home between the ceremony and the reception, but I bet most of the food had been sitting in people's cars since that morning. Oh, and also, the church that she moved to did the whole no kissing before marriage thing, and she started making out with her new husband on the altar to the point where the pastor had to say, "Okay, that's enough." The whole thing was weird. Bride entered to Braveheart soundtrack blasting on a boombox. The civil service that lasted a few minutes started at around 1 p.m. She leaves to the same blasting Braveheart soundtrack. The mother announces that the reception starts at 5:30 p.m. There's no food and no bar, but trays of dessert bars that will be served. We're also told the venue is locked until then, so there's no place to wait. My girlfriend and I left with a crowd of people to across the street at an Irish pub for drinks. A bit of a party breaks out. We all get told to knock it off and come back and wait at the venue in the hall. So we sit on the hall on the carpet for a few hours without drinks or dinner. Bride and groom arrive and enter the venue to an honor guard of floor hockey players wearing hockey jerseys and holding sticks above their heads like swords at a royal wedding. More Braveheart music, of course. The place emptied out pretty quickly as people either left to go back to the pub or to the fast food place a bit further away. Our dinner was lemon squares and a can of Coke from a vending machine in the lobby. Funny stuff. It's a tie between my sister breaking her knee at her own wedding dancing to the Cotton-Eyed Joe, and my sister having her reception at an honest-to-God truck stop while 6 months pregnant. In her defense, the food was good, but wow, was it weird walking through a gas station in formal wear. For some unknown reason, she'd latched onto this weird truck stop restaurant that my family goes to sometimes for late dinners, since it's open 24 hours. The food was buffet style, fried chicken, mashed potatoes, and salad. We did have a private room, which was very weird that it existed. The only way to get into the restaurant is to walk through the attached gas station. It felt very redneck, considering how non-redneck my stepsister typically is. I officiated that wedding though, so I guess I can't judge too harshly. My friend's wedding. The bride wanted to sing him a song, so she did a kind of karaoke thing. There's bad singing, and then there's whatever the hell that was. It was so awkward. Also, dude asked a professional photographer friend of ours to photograph the wedding about a year before. Got a super non-committal answer, never followed up, and was shocked that the photographer didn't show up, after he specifically declined the invitation because he was going to be in another country. Had the entire set of groomsmen rent ridiculously expensive tuxedos, which, fine, cool, happy to be here. He's having his tux custom-tailored and asks for something ridiculous and gaudy, but when quoted the price, says he can't swing that and insists they do it for about a quarter of that price. They do their best to meet the specifications within the given price range, but it's bad. Really bad. So the groomsmen look amazing and he looks like a clown that didn't put on his makeup. Has another friend make a custom batch of mead for the toasts, but rents a hall that doesn't allow outside alcohol, so it can't be used for the toast during the reception. It was probably the cringiest thing I've ever seen. Not just the cringiest wedding or even cringiest thing at a wedding. The cringiest thing, period. The minister or pastor used to date the bride and gushed about how wonderful she was. Told the groom that if he ever died, not to worry, he'd take care of her. I was shell-shocked. I so wished I could think of a reason to ask the couple for a copy of the video of their wedding, but I couldn't quite find a legit one. Probably my cousin's wedding. The food was really bad, and I mean really bad. Things that were supposed to be warm or hot were ice cold and completely undercooked. There was music, but no one was allowed to dance because we don't want people to dance on our wedding. There was also no alcohol. Not a single drop. But the worst thing was the seating arrangement. They didn't plan on families or friends sitting together. I don't know what they were thinking. I was sitting on a table with complete strangers. They even separated our grandparents from one another. After an hour, my grandmother stood up, walked over to my grandfather, and both declared that they were leaving now to the restaurant down the road in order to have something good to eat and a beer. I joined them as well as my parents. It didn't take long for people to notice that our seats were empty. Really easy to figure out since no one was allowed to dance or walk around in general. We got a call from one of my uncles asking where we were at. After we explained why we left, he said, "You know what? You're right. This is bullcrap." And we ended up with like 20 guests from the wedding in that small restaurant having a fun evening. I still don't know why they even bothered celebrating their wedding. They also never invited us again. And that's actually a good thing because now I don't need to find an excuse as to why I can't join their future, quote, parties. Okay, so as soon as the bride and groom went out to the church, everyone went to go congratulate them and give gifts, which are usually flowers or alcohol and envelopes. The bride had a pen and a notebook, and she signed each envelope or wrote in a notebook if someone didn't give her an envelope. Later, as we went to the restaurant where the party was about to start, we waited for 2 hours for the pair. Turns out they made a stop during their ride to count the money. As they finally got to the party, they started complaining that they didn't make enough to pay for the party expenses and earn more. They only spent time with the rich part of the family. The poor tables didn't get the good cakes and food. There was literally different food on some tables. I sat near our poor part of the family. No meat or cakes made it to their table. Me and like 7 other people didn't get forks, only spoons. Why would you give forks to someone when there's only soup for them to eat, right? Now, mind you, I gave them enough to pay for like 5 plates per person, and I helped them during preparations. I even baked a few cakes that I didn't get to eat in the end. Half of the people got out after like 20 minutes. The bride called them all terrible for ruining her dream wedding. It was the worst wedding ever, and that's just a part of the whole wedding mess. I wish I'd had a car back then so I could go back home as well, as the wedding was terrible for many other reasons. The groom was cheap, and the bride was a Karen to be. What's the worst monster you've ever had for a neighbor? When my wife and I moved into our house in the summer of 2019, the neighbors on either side of us warned us about the people renting the house directly behind ours. Apparently, they'd been known to cause trouble and blow things way out of proportion, bordering on paranoia of everyone around them. We kept it in mind, but had no issues for the first 6 months or so after moving in. Their house sits on a hill behind ours, and so overlooks the majority of our backyard due to the elevation change. Well, one night, or morning technically, at about 3 a.m., we wake up to ring notifications from our phones showing video from our front doorbell. There's a man standing barefoot in a sleeveless shirt on our porch pounding on our front door. We give it 2 to 3 minutes of just watching him on the app thinking maybe he's drunk and has the wrong house, essentially giving him the benefit of the doubt. But then we start to hear him say, "Come out, you frickin' prevert, I'm gonna F you up," etc. And then he leaves the porch and starts to head around the side of the house towards our backyard. Considering we had no idea who this was, my wife now immediately calls the cops as I move out of our bedroom towards the external doors to look and listen for any attempt at a home invasion. At this point, our neighbors directly behind us throw a huge spotlight onto our backyard from theirs. We're thinking, okay, cool, they know something's up and they're trying to help us out by shedding light on our backyard. The cops arrive several long minutes later and knock. We explain the situation and they head out back to look around and get the scoop from the neighbors with the spotlight. It turns out that the spotlight neighbor was the one on our porch. He'd jumped our fence into our backyard and up into his yard and then threw the light on. He told the police that several nights prior I'd let my puppy out onto my own backyard in the middle of the night, and because I was in my boxers that I was trying to expose myself to his family, because they could look down onto our entire yard from where theirs sits. He then followed this up to the police with evidence which consisted of videos he'd taken through our windows of my wife and I inside our own home, doing totally normal things like chores and watching TV. Nothing inappropriate or scandalous, not that it would have mattered anyway because we were in our own home. Because of the elevation difference, if they went out of their way they could technically slightly see through our closed blinds due to the angle. So they'd been filming us for no reason at all and expected the police to see this as reasonable. The cops came back in and my wife was devastated. It was a huge breach of our privacy, of course, and totally unfounded accusations as we'd never done anything to anger these people. We hadn't even met them. The police told us, just don't worry about it, if he tries something again, just give us a call, which wasn't the most comforting at the time. They moved out a few months later without any additional issues. My wife and I celebrated like it was a holiday when we saw the moving van in their driveway. I assume we'll have many more extended neighbor wars in the series to come, but this is for sure a very brief and spirited encounter with these crazies that clearly made you uncomfortable right up until they did you the favor of getting out of there. Lived in a small apartment, and my neighbors always cranked up their music to 11, like loud, and until something like 7 a.m. Maybe it went later than that, but that's when I'd leave for work anyway. It was so loud that I couldn't hear my own TV over it. My neighbors and I would bang on the door, but they'd never open it. It was like trying to sleep at a festival. Then at some point, I found out that they often left for a bar across the street, but would just leave the music on. So I'd pull the breaker for their apartment, but they would just come back at 5 a.m. and turn it right back on. It was reported by heaps of people, but nothing was ever done. So at some point, I'd jam their lock when they went out so their keys wouldn't work anymore, and they had to get the property manager in while the music was blasting inside. After a couple of times of that happening, they were evicted. Maybe I'm the bad neighbor in this story. This is the definition of chaotic good. Their dogs got into my backyard and attacked my dog. My dog ended up okay, but it was a long recovery and he still doesn't walk right. He was and is the happiest dog ever, so to see him on the ground covered in blood was the worst thing ever. The dogs were able to get through because their kids had taken a plank out of my fence. They didn't have a fence. I left a letter on their door explaining the situation. They showed up at my door to tell me that it was my fault for not having a stronger fence, and that they wouldn't be paying any medical bills. After a lot of them yelling and me calmly explaining why they would actually be paying, they eventually complied. They did build a fence backwards with the flat side facing them. They're also loud as F, have chickens that escape on a regular basis in our suburban neighborhood, and are overall scummy people. When I started my first job post-college, I was thrilled to live by myself for the first time in my life. I had this beautiful one-bedroom apartment in a solid part of town. Everything was great until 6 months later when new tenants moved in next to my unit. I had a package go missing, a phone case. Amazon had posted a photo of it at my door, so I thought that it was just a fluke. Then it happened again, and again, and again. The office wouldn't accept packages, so I had to get my items delivered to my friends' places instead. Overall, wildly inconvenient, and the police didn't care in the slightest when I reported it, so I just figured I'd deal with it. Fast forward a few weeks, and I came home after being gone for less than an hour to see that my doorknob and front door were scraped up and the knob was barely hanging on. Long story short, I'd been parking in plain view of this guy's window, so he was able to tell when I was home. I'm 100% convinced he tried to break into my place, and that me coming home early interrupted him. I googled his name after I moved, I got it off a package at his door, and I found out he was a convicted felon with charges that included grand theft auto, domestic attacks, substance dealing, and an attempted break-in. Apartment building. The upstairs neighbor's dog peed on their patio and it dripped down onto me while I was sitting outside reading them. I yelled and ran in to shower, and when I texted them to ask them to take their dog out to pee in the future, they said it wasn't their dog, and it must have blown in from somewhere else? What? My worst neighbors were definitely the crap-bag 19-year-olds that lived next door to me when I was finishing up college that screamed at Call of Duty at the top of their lungs through paper-thin walls every night when they got killed, and who also threw a pumpkin on the roof of my car, causing $3,000 worth of damage, which is considered felony vandalism in Michigan. I finally got them to confess and basically gave them a stern talking to as a 22-year-old that was just done with college nonsense at that point, and told him I wasn't going to press charges as long as his insurance paid for it. Later that year, when his roommate was flipping out about Call of Duty and yelled something along the lines of, "God damn it, frickin' hackers, everyone's frickin' cheating, what the frick is this bullcrap? I hate this game so much, bunch of frickin' losers and cheaters," which was very clear through my bedroom wall while I was studying, I didn't hesitate, since it had been months of this. After he got done with his tantrum, I shouted back, "Sounds like you just suck at COD, bro." I heard a crash of what sounded like a controller being banished to the Shadow Realm, and then didn't hear anything from him for about a month. It was glorious. Yeah, when I play with people who are cheating, I quit and report them. This was almost definitely a skill issue. If they're playing that often and still suck that badly, it's time to adopt a more accepting nature in defeat. Or just switch to single-player games. That's what the rest of us trash-tier gamers do. Oh, I have a few stories from the same neighbor who I'll call Linda. Linda would often have men outside the apartment building that she locked out, screaming her name. But the best story regards a boyfriend Linda had who insisted my roommate and I call him the Captain. About a week after meeting him, we came home to a wedding announcement for Linda and the Captain. Yes, his name was the Captain on the announcement. Exactly 1 week after that announcement, the Captain was arrested outside our apartment building for public intoxication at 2 a.m. while screaming, "I've made a huge mistake! F you, Linda! I'm ruined!" We rented a house that had another apartment in the basement. The lady who lived below us kept to herself for the most part, so we didn't see her much. Part of our rental was a detached garage, and she asked if she could put a small deep freezer in our garage. We were using it for storage, so we were fine with it. After a couple of weeks of having her freezer in there, it somehow got unplugged and she came unglued on us and wanted us to pay to replace everything. I understood her frustration, but we hardly ever went into the garage since it was only for storage. In other words, we definitely didn't unplug it and our landlord agreed. But she was mad. She had a son in college who came home for the summer. During that same summer, he found a cat and brought it home. His mum said no cats inside, so he'd feed the kitten outside. She was pretty wild. He left for school again in the fall and we noticed that the cat was getting very thin. We started feeding her outside in the usual spot. Around Christmas, we bought a bag of cat food and I made a plate of cookies and left them both at our neighbor's front door. The next day, they were both back on our porch. Rude, but whatever. We continued to feed the cat because she obviously wasn't feeding her. A few weeks later, the cat came to our door crying. She was trying to come inside. Super weird considering she was pretty wild and we'd never let her inside before. I let her in and noticed she was pregnant and for sure about to have babies. I made her a little corner and she had the babies the next day. We let her stay in the house with us, but we knew we couldn't keep her. I went downstairs to talk to the neighbor. She said that her son's cat was a boy, so the cat obviously wasn't his. I posted on Facebook to see if anyone was interested in fostering a cat and her kittens because we couldn't keep her. Her son saw my post on Facebook and got super mad at his mum. She then called the cops and said that I stole her cat and lied to her when she confronted me about having the cat in my possession. The police called animal control, who then contacted us. They asked us to take the cat and her kittens to the shelter so that if our neighbor really wanted the cats, she'd have to pay the fee as well as get her vaccinated and licensed. We did take them to the shelter, and as far as I know, she did pay the fees to pick her up. However, I did see her on the animal shelter's Facebook adoption page not long after that. Poor baby. For the record, I was heartbroken to have to take her into the shelter. I felt awful for moving her and her babies around like that. I'm sure that she was so anxious and scared. We would have tried to keep her, but we were moving to a new place that same week, hence the urgency to find her a foster home. And we weren't allowed to have pets. All authorities involved thought that she was nuts, and I think they were also frustrated to have to deal with this stupid situation. It was the stupidest, most infuriating thing that ever happened to me as far as neighbors go. You can submit your own stories to be featured here on the channel. The story submission link is in the description below. And if you want to listen to some vibey music in the background, check out easymode, also linked below, and subscribe. We had some neighbors that used to leave their garbage out in plastic bags the night before garbage day instead of leaving out bins. Around here, that's just ringing the dinner bell for raccoons and other critters. Sure enough, come morning, there's garbage strewn all over the neighborhood. What the raccoons and skunks didn't spread around, the wind picked up the slack. Some people on the street kindly approached the guy and asked him to put his garbage in a bin. He told them to go F themselves, and thus began garbage wars. Every morning of garbage day, some people on my street would collect all the half-eaten and rotten trash from their lawns and toss it back onto the guy's backyard. He'd collect it and then dump it back on their lawns, or cram it into their bushes. People started finding half-eaten burritos and candy wrappers in their mailboxes. The street just started to look like a slum. The police were called, health inspectors, city bylaw enforcement. Each side was calling in whatever authority they could muster to get their enemy in the crap. This guy and his family, amazingly his wife seemed perfectly pleasant, lasted about 8 months and then moved. Every once in a while I find a random margarine lid or piece of styrofoam in my hedge, and my mind goes back to those dark days of the war. I lived in an apartment with lots of rotating tenants. An elderly lady moved in across the hall from me and promptly started hoarding. I started to figure it out when her deck and porch started to fill up with odds and ends furniture, including but not limited to a roll-top desk. She also yelled at me once for taking her key out of the front door and putting it in the mail slot. Anyway, after a couple of weeks, I started to realize I hadn't seen her in a while and started to smell something really weird. Turns out she had passed away and no one knew about it for a week, hence the smell. Her family came and cleared out all of her stuff about a week afterwards. This is Wisconsin in the winter, and I had my good Doc Marten work boots outside my door because they were wet. They used one of my boots to prop open their door while they moved out and then stole them when they were done. Yeah, sadly, this is a thing that you hear about being fairly commonplace with elderly hoarders. One day, those towers of stuff fall down and the poor folks are trapped. Awful way to go. Also, trash move by the family, first leaving grandma alone to expire like that, and then just doing a little bit of extra theft on the way out. He lived in the apartment right below my husband and I. It went from constant complaints, to him calling the cops on us multiple times, to him leaving threatening messages on our car and front door. When we first moved in, he was upset with the landlord for renting above him, and left plenty of unpleasant notes and interrupted quite a few times when we were talking to the landlord. When we moved in, we only had a mattress and no other furniture, but he kept calling the landlord saying that we were moving furniture around at 2 a.m. and had our TV on at full blast. After the 8th complaint in 2 months about us still moving our furniture around and TV being too loud, we finally showed our apartment to the landlord. We literally didn't have a TV and still only had our mattress. Then the neighbor started leaving notes on our car, telling us to keep it down, and he even put it in writing, "There needs to be no noise after 10 p.m. or else I'll call the cops." We usually didn't even get home until after 11 p.m., and we were respectful to make sure that we kept things down because we knew that not everyone had our work schedule. So we tried keeping it down even more, and there were so many instances when we'd be eating our dinner or cuddling quietly or even sleeping, and then he'd be banging on his ceiling or our floor. After a few months, he started calling the cops, and it got to the point where even the cops told him to stop calling about a noise complaint because it's a landlord issue. And every time they came, they never heard anything. The last time they showed up, I was asleep, and my husband ended up talking to them and explaining everything. They suggested that we file a harassment complaint. Then the cops showed up at the coffee shop I worked at the time and explained that they were getting almost nightly calls, and they suggested to me, too, that we should file a harassment complaint against the neighbor. Then he started leaving threatening notes on our car and front door, and we kept hearing our doorknob jiggling. He claimed that he and a friend had sat outside our apartment for 2 hours and listened to all the noise we were making, that he's a retired cop and would call in a few favors if we kept making noise. He knows where we park, so we'd better start parking it somewhere else if we don't want it to get damaged. We kept the notes and made copies for the landlord and let him know that this was what we were dealing with, so we're just keeping him in the loop before crap started getting real, aka, we're tired of this, and if an old guy gets his crap rocked, then just know that it's been a long time coming. The last complaint was when he ran outside to the landlord screaming that something needed to be done about us because he heard our bed squeak the night before, and how dare he rent to some crazy college kids who were partying and having wild group fun times in the bedroom all night. The landlord finally told him to F off and stop being a bitter old man. Then the neighbor took a total 180 and we found out he had decided to sue the landlord and was moving. Suddenly the neighbor kept offering us rides when one of us were walking. He stopped complaining and leaving notes, but our doorknob kept jiggling and turning around at midnight. And whenever we'd check on our door, we'd hear someone running down the hall as we'd approach our door. He eventually moved away, and shockingly, we haven't gotten a complaint from any other neighbor in the last 3 years we've lived here. I rented a flat with an ex, and the upstairs neighbor was an absolute nightmare. Deadbeat dad who had his kid every weekend and left them screaming all the time. He'd blast music until sunrise every day, even when he had his kid. We got the council involved and nothing happened. Got child services involved. Nothing happened. He used to argue every Sunday with his ex about how he wasn't paying child support. They'd argue right outside our door when we were on the ground floor. The guy was unemployed, owed the landlord a lot of money, and only left his flat to get groceries or substances. He kicked off at me because my cat meowed loudly one time. Well, they were smackheads, plain and simple. They had 2 kids and were constantly physically and verbally rowing at each other and were hoarders on top of it. Tried calling Child Protective Services and the police over and over, and it was never taken seriously. They ended up burning down their apartment and caused thousands of dollars in damage to the rest of our apartment building because they were cooking crystal. We had to move out, as did so many others. The silver lining was that they finally got their kids taken away after that. This dude pretended to be a reverend but was actually just a filthy frickin' hoarder. He insisted on wearing sandals all of the time, and whenever he left his flat, the entire stairwell would stink of century-old unwashed feet. Eventually, the beetles that had infested his flat crawled up into our kitchen and then everywhere. It took months to get him evicted. Screw that guy. Had one that would basically steal our mail and other stuff from our porch and yard. Caught her once to confront her, and she started yelling at me to stop attacking her and tried to say I was stealing her stuff. Ended up with the police getting called and us filing a restraining order against her. How much space does a neighbor have to give you on a restraining order? I'm guessing they're not expected to have to move from parts of their house that are within the radius of said order. I've never known anyone to have one in real life. They're a strange concept to me. Moved into a crappy apartment in a building that was occupied by basically the worst people in the area. Pretty rural small town, junkies, alcoholics, and other interesting specimens. I moved there because I don't have a driver's license and I needed to live close to my new job at a cafe. There were no buses in the area except school buses, and it was relatively cheap to live there. Anyways, one night when I came home from work, I met two of my neighbors by the entrance to the building. These two were living wall to wall with me, and I'd listened to their substanced-up saturnalias more than once. They started following me up the stairs, not saying a single word, just following me. I rushed inside and locked the door, and then they started hammering at it. Yelling, hammering their hands at the door so hard I thought they'd break it. I yelled back at them, "What the frick do you want? Leave me alone." They stopped their hammering, and the man said with a fragile voice, "We were just wondering if we could borrow your pee for a substance test tomorrow." I not so politely declined and told them to F off and called the cops. Didn't live there for much longer, I'll tell you that. I used to live in a house that was split into two apartments. My neighbors had the lower half, and I learned we had issues with the HVAC when their cigarette smoke came visibly pouring out our registers, stank up everything we owned, and then one of them stole my car. My neighbors create this toxic smoke out of their chimney, which we suspect is them making illegal substances. Our neighbor was tossing bags of her upchuck into my yard for about a year, like 50 bags. I called the cops. Turns out she had an eating disorder and was hiding it from her parents. My neighbor once shot both of my dogs and his goat and made me bury both of them. One dog survived, thankfully. He then tried to make me pay for a new goat, claiming that our dogs attacked it. The goat had a bullet wound and no bite marks. I have a schizophrenic neighbor that has believed for years that I'm hacking his electronic devices, scanning his phone, harassing and terrorizing him. Over the years, he's claimed that I've held an old man hostage in my condo and allowed blood to drip from my patio to his, and that I'm a terrible racist. He leaves notes on the inside of his car accusing me of these things. This guy owned 6 cars and kept them all parked on the street in a very congested block of apartments. Spent hours tending to them, and they somehow always looked rustier when he was done. If a leaf landed on one of his cars, he'd accuse the neighborhood of intentionally placing leaves on his car to annoy him. My current neighbors will randomly light bombshell fireworks in the middle of the night during the middle of the week, as if some of us don't have to wake up early for work. Also, when I was younger and living in a different city, our front neighbors stole our dog from our backyard one day, and we didn't find out it was them until a few months later when we saw our dog in their yard. They denied they stole it and wouldn't give it back to us until we got the cops involved. Tour guides. What absolute wildcards have you had to deal with in your tours? I led a scuba diving tour. While signing the safety waivers and all that, one very old man kept telling us that he had a DNR, a Do Not Resuscitate order. We plainly told him that we're not bound to a DNR, and if he passed out for any reason, we'd attempt to resuscitate by our safety training. Pretty much all the divers are just assuming that this guy is going to try and bookend the story of his life down there, probably by spitting out the regulator and going quietly into the night. The dive happens, and pretty much everyone is hawk-eyed on this guy. I see him go behind a large coral head and lay down in the sand and spit out his reg. He's only at about 60 feet depth, so I grab him and wrestle him to the surface. He won't take my backup regulator, so I slam it against his mouth and purge air into his face. We get to the surface and he's fighting me non-stop, trying to pull all of his gear off. I throw a very hard punch to his jaw and knock him out. We're actually trained to do this during dive rescues to keep panicked people from killing us as well. 3 weeks later, he tries to sue my dive shop and myself personally. Thankfully, it ended up getting dropped, but it did take a while. In short, a guy tried to use our business to not be alive anymore and traumatize a whole bunch of other people in the process. About 15 years ago, I worked as a deckhand on a line of boats that took people out to Fort Sumter. The trip was about an hour each way. One day, we were about halfway there, and two teenagers just decided it would be fun to jump off and swim to shore. This is in Charleston Harbor, which has a pretty solid tidal current and probably more sharks than one would like to think about. We ended up having to perform a water rescue on them, then continue onto the fort with the Coast Guard coming and picking them up. All in all, an extreme act of stupidity. I used to do vineyard and garden tours for a pretty well-known winery. I had a lady ask to see any Merlot vines we had, so I walked her over, and she proceeded to dump ash all over them and yell, "We love you, Nana! Rest in peace!" Needless to say, you're not allowed to dump human remains on food goods. I should mention the ashes came out of a gallon Ziploc baggie. It was a Christmas-themed one though, so maybe that makes it more tasteful. Well, that's alright then. As long as the Ziploc bag with the desiccated remains of Grandma was festive. Feels like you wanted a fitting anecdote to end her life story with, and instead probably got a walkout by security and got that vine uprooted as well. I'm a bush pilot in Alaska and occasionally do glacier air tours if my boss asks me. I'm not a fan of doing tours in general though. One day I was doing a glacier tour and had probably 7 people on board, and the guy sitting next to me just looks at me and says, "I'm the captain now," and yanks the plane 30 degrees to the right, and then lets go and laughs and says he was just kidding. There was yelling to follow via my mouth. I work in the backcountry ski guiding industry, working my way to becoming a lead guide. Guests are always trying to unalive themselves, but there's one that stands out. Right now, I mostly tail guide and pick up people when they fall, which is most of the time. One particularly deep day, I'm sweeping a tree run, and all of a sudden there's a man digging frantically in the snow towards a pair of legs. His wife had fallen headfirst down the slope in a flat area. When she lawn darted, the first half of her body was buried in the snow, and only her legs and feet were visible. Her husband thought it was a good idea to stand on top of where her face obviously was, and started digging near the exposed part of her body. I guess in the moment he forgot human anatomy and where her head might be. At this point, I was maybe 3 minutes behind him, so she'd had her face under the surface for a while. I told him to stop and move, and then yelled, "Stop! You're on her face!" I tried adding a couple of expletives, but there was no response from him. I finally had to grab him by the backpack and powerbomb him down the slope. I uncovered her face in like 10 seconds. She gasped for air, had a cry, and then proceeded to tear that man to pieces verbally. I used to be a tour guide at a primate sanctuary with a strict no-touching policy. At the end of the tour, there's a suspension bridge. Tourists go first, guide goes last as per the rules. I always warn the tourists that the other side is the territory of the Hanuman Langur, and he doesn't mess around. Keep your distance, etc. He doesn't attack people out of nowhere, but he likes showing his teeth and screaming, which scares tourists. Anyway, one tour, I get to the other side of the bridge and a tourist has been bitten. He says a monkey just bit him out of nowhere. I ask the other tourists. No, he tried to fricking pet the Hanuman. Idiot got what he deserved. I was on a tour in New Orleans. A guy gets drunk and basically makes a fool of himself and slaps his partner. Everyone else on the tour is like, "Whoa, not cool, take a hike." Girlfriend leaves with him. The next morning, we're all on the bus waiting to roll out to the next destination, and we're not moving. 30 minutes later, we're all getting real angry, and then the couple get on the bus looking sheepish. By the next stop, we learn the drunk guy ran a bath at the hotel, passed out, and it flooded the bathroom and 4 floors below into the hotel lobby. The hotel wouldn't let them leave without paying thousands of dollars. Karma for him, I think. So I was doing an English language camp for foreign kids. We took the kids on a day tour to London, which involved going up the London Eye. While in the queue, one of the kids started shouting that he had a bomb in his bag and he was going to blow everyone up. Almost got all 20 kids in the group kicked out. On an open-topped tour bus in London, a woman tries to dangle her toddler over the railing and then starts saying she's going to complain to my manager when I tell her to stop. Caught her doing it again, and company policy said that anyone endangering their kids like that was to be removed from the tour, so the driver had to come up and march her off. She still insisted she did nothing wrong, like she literally had the kid's feet on the side rail of the moving bus and was just holding him loosely around the waist. One low-hanging tree branch, of which there were many on the route, and that kid would have been gone. I was working on a tourist island in Australia when this man pulled out almost all of the back feathers of a peacock because he wanted to keep one. He snuck up behind it, grabbed a huge handful and just yanked. He was immediately escorted off the island. The peacock had a huge bare patch, and most of its beautiful feathers were gone. I used to work at a heritage site. It was an old military installation with a lot of remaining original structures, like bunk beds, cafeteria equipment, computers, among other stuff. Every day, it was a constant effort to remind people, read kids, to not jump on the beds, not to slam doors open, and not to punch every button like it owes them money. The absolute worst was a group of kids on a school trip. Within the first 10 minutes, we're walking through the tech portion of the exhibit, where we had a wall lined with Burroughs' large systems machines, B5000s, all behind this little fence about waist high. I turned to demonstrate some of the pieces, and when I look back at the group, one of them has jumped the barrier, opened one of the units, and started pulling out handfuls of digital tape from the reels inside. I just about jumped on the kid when their teacher did just that. She jumped the barrier, smacked the kid's hands, and took him outside. I immediately ended the tour and had them all refunded, as I couldn't imagine what else could happen. My one took a big dump in front of the group. So we tour through streets and parks and make it really clear that the toilets at the beginning of the tour are the only ones for the first 90 minutes. We get to a park about 30 minutes into the tour. Not a big park, mind you, it's basically a big roundabout with a swing set, bench, and 2 trees. I'm in the middle of my spiel in the park when I see a guy at the back of the group step away, pull his pants down, and squat on the grass. Of course, I was stunned and lost my flow, which had everyone looking around only to recoil in horror as this guy drops a log like it was nothing. He wasn't even ashamed. I took a class of middle schoolers to a museum, and one of my jerk students dragged his hand across a 3,000-year-old Indian painting. Later, I found out the object was almost certainly a reproduction, but I nearly died of rage on the spot. The student was with us on a 45-day placement for severe behavioral issues. He'd earned enough points in school to qualify for the field trip. Never again, kid. I work at a brewery tap room and take people on brewery tours. During fermentation, CO2 is produced and excess comes out through a runoff pipe and into a water bucket. One of the attendees, who was being a pain and trying to be funny but no one was laughing, asked me what the pipe was for, so I gladly explained. He then asked what would happen if he breathed it in. In disbelief of his stupidity, I told him he'd pass out and damage his brain. He then proceeded to grab the pipe and take a breath. He was then ejected and barred. Some people are just beyond belief. I think a lot of us wonder what happens to those kids at school who eat bugs or toxic things for the amusement of others in the playground. Turns out they're basically doing the same thing in all manner of locales decades later. What an idiot. My co-worker's story. He was a tour manager for South America. We tended to work with older travelers, like 60 or above. Him and his guests were flying from Lima to Cusco, Peru, which is about 10,000 feet in elevation. This is a group of about 40 travelers. Apparently, he had one male guest who had IBS or something, and in mid-flight, he crapped himself. The stench was unbearable as they were in a small aircraft taking them to Cusco so high in the mountains. He said he had to help escort this guy to the bathroom in the back, but as he stood up, the brown just came down his leg, so now he's dragging this stuff down with him to the toilet. Once he got to the loo, he cleaned it up with the assistance of the aircraft attendant. He was very embarrassed, but not as embarrassed as the guy who'd made brown. Once they landed, the guy who'd done this was in the bathroom, apologetic, and was cleaning himself up. The guide went into the airport and brought him some new Peruvian-style pants, and then came back to the airport to help dress this guy in the bathroom. I'd say that was probably one of the worst stories I've heard to happen to an individual. I've also heard of a fellow co-worker who guides tourists in Vietnam, and had to bail out a tourist from jail one time. She had received a phone call in the middle of the night from him, in jail, asking for help. She showed up and asked the man what happened. The Vietnamese police said he was caught purchasing little blue pills and exchanging money for favors from working girls. You can submit your own stories to be featured here on the channel. The story submission link is in the description below. And if you want to listen to some vibey music in the background, check out easymode, also linked below, and subscribe. I worked at a living history farm museum. I had a kid that was climbing on stuff the whole tour in the farmhouse and trying to get behind the smith in the blacksmith shop during a demo. After the tour, when people are allowed to roam the grounds, I hear his mum screaming and look over to the barn, and this kid has climbed the fence into the field with our longhorn oxen and is trying to poke them with a stick. I walk over and calmly told him to get out of the field before our lazy oxen decide they've had enough. But this little jerk decides to look me in the eye and smack Ted on the butt with the stick like it's a riding crop. Ted, bless him, just kinda jumps a little and whips his head around with a "what the frick, dude" look on his face. But seeing as he's a longhorn, he just kinda wipes this kid out with one of his horns when he's turned his head. The kid goes flying into the dirt and is having a meltdown. Mum is freaking out, and I'm like, dude, get the heck out of the pen before Ted actually gets mad. So this kid is crying and trying to climb the fence out of the field, and Bill, who's been watching this whole thing, waits until the kid is almost over the fence, walks up to him, and nudges him in the butt with his nose and pushes him over the top of the fence. It was everything I could do to keep from laughing. The kid was fine, Ted was fine, but the kid and his mum were promptly kicked out of the museum. Their dad and little sister were allowed to stay because she was well behaved and was just enjoying petting the goats at the zoo. Since the kid had to leave but his sister didn't, there was a temper tantrum in the parking lot that could be heard all the way on the other side of the farm. But the oxen got some extra grain that night, so I guess they won in the end. I was once a tour guide in high school for a group of young Chinese students coming to the rural US on a sort of fresh air trip. They told us beforehand that we had to keep the kids away from water because apparently parents don't value swimming lessons in China and there is such little open swimmable water that no one learns on their own. We were also told that the kids think swimming happens naturally. Like if you go into the water, you'll immediately start swimming. Anyways, one of our excursions was to a local reservoir, and the plan was to hike up a hill nearby to overlook the reservoir lake, get a few photos, and then leave. When we got to the top, it started pouring rain like I'd never seen before. I'm talking so much rain you can't see 5 feet in front of you. Then lightning starts striking the lake, and I'm still trying to keep it cool even though I'd never been so close to lightning before. The kids were taking it well and laughing, which was good, until they started running directly for the lake and jumping in. Apparently, they'd also never learned about electricity conducting through water. So I'm freaking out and start pulling them out of the water. They weren't in very far. A couple of them complained that their phones were wet in the rain. No one got hurt, but it was a crazy day. We got back on the bus and the kids started drinking liquor in the back. Some of them were as young as 9 years old, the oldest were about 16, so I had to bust them for that too. In short, apparently Chinese kids think swimming will just happen if you go in water, especially lightning-struck water. Tour guide at a university. We got a lot of guests that really don't want to be there. Mostly misbehaved kids from a poor area of the city. We toured at all times, even during finals week. As many may know, sound can travel oddly in lecture centers. Our lecture centers have windows around them, and like 6 kids thought it would be hilarious to smash on the windows. From the inside, it sounded like small arms fire being shot from the outside, or at least muffled shots. I watched 100+ students flee the classroom during their final exam. We got a lot of crap for that. It really isn't easy corralling a group of school kids. That's the chaperone's job. A friend of mine does whiskey tours in a museum in Dublin. Someone took a dump in one of the exhibition rooms. I had a guest, snorkeling, trying to grab the tail of a barracuda as he swam up behind it. Luckily, I was able to hit the guest with a dive fin from the boat to stop him before he got a hold. If he had grabbed on, I'm sure he would have been ripped to pieces by that fish. A couple of guys I used to play cricket with went on a school trip to Auschwitz and decided to steal a small pair of glasses and some buttons they found half buried in the ground. They were detained by Polish police while they were leaving the site. Hard to know what goes through people's heads sometimes. I watched a man run up to the side of the platform the winged victory statue is on in the Louvre and throw his arm around it for a photo. Security got him down pretty quickly. I'm shocked that he actually made it up there. That feels like it could have seriously ended in a security dogpile and criminal charges. You never know though, it's hard to prosecute people just for being stupid. I'm in the middle of talking and someone's phone rings. Okay, that happens sometimes and usually they just cancel the call or step outside. Nope, this guy answers the call and starts talking on the phone only a few meters from where I'm standing. I think, oh, he'll just quickly explain that he's busy and end the call. Nope. He starts a conversation. The rest of the group glare at him and I'm put in an awkward position because my workplace put a huge emphasis on politeness. So I suggest to him to continue his call in the hallway just outside the room we were in, to which he replied, "No, I'm fine here," and went back to his phone conversation. I'm doing my best to talk to the rest of the group, about 25 people, but he's so loud. Eventually, this Chinese woman yells across the room at him, "Shut up! We want to listen to the lady, not you!" Which worked. But I just couldn't imagine the nerve to ruin everyone's experience like that because you're too selfish to talk on the phone outside. Also, the place I work allowed photos but had a strict no photos of the staff rule for privacy reasons. I always explain this at the start, and 99% of people are cool. One day I had a particularly happy snapper who got right up in a staff member's face to take a photo. Like, I'm talking centimeters from his face to take this. The staffer was just some rando middle-aged white guy, so I'm not sure why the fascination, but he was livid. It's like I saw it happen in slow motion, so I couldn't do anything to stop it. The offending tourist was removed. I work ground crew for a company that does helicopter tours. Number one rule for customers is don't walk under the tail boom, the rotor will kill you and it will hurt. It's unbelievable how many people have a death wish out there. People see the fastest way to the other side of the helicopter and don't stop to think, oh hey, that spinning blade may or may not slice my whole frickin' head off. Let's see how close we can get to it. I'm a tour guide and boat captain in the Caribbean. We had about 40 or 50 people on the boat, getting off. We would normally go and feed swimming pigs, which someone would get nipped from them from doing stupid crap, but nothing too serious. Well, the next stop after that was another island where we would hand feed turtles, sharks, and stingrays. So we'd tell people to hold it with the palm open and food in the middle for the stingrays, and they'd come over the top and just remove it. For the turtles and sharks, you put it in the water holding onto the tips, and when they're coming, let it go. Well, of course, this idiot decided he'd be tough and feed this baby shark, no longer than your forearm, without letting go of the food. The shark proceeds to bite his fingers, he screams and jumps out of the water and flicks it off with his hand, pulling off one of his fingernails in the process. That's the one I always remember. I used to give tours at my university. There was a group of middle schoolers I was giving a tour to show them why they should want to go to college, yada yada, and there was this one kid who kept trying to sneak away and was whistling at just about every girl who walked by. Weird. Okay, whatever, he thinks he's a big shot. Then a very attractive girl comes jogging by us and he tried to grab her. And then as she runs away, he just starts thrusting in her direction. I was mortified. I ended the tour, I was done with him. The teachers didn't even care. That was probably the worst part of it. Didn't happen to me per se, but one of the company's tour guides was on a flight with a bunch of middle schoolers. One of the boys got caught tickling his pickle in his seat next to a girl who wasn't even from his school. Ugh. Former whitewater rafting guide. There's a calmer section of the river where people can, if they choose to, hop out and swim through. They're wearing life jackets, so you can just float through it. This woman decides she wants to try it and hops out. After she pops up slowly, she tilts forward until just the back of her jacket is out of the water and she's completely still. After 5 or so seconds of this, I start to realize this might not be intentional and I paddle over and physically pick her head up above the water, followed by her gasping for air. I haul her into the boat and ask what happened. She said she didn't know what to do as she had never been submerged in water before. Whew. 1. Why are you on a whitewater rafting trip? And 2. Why didn't your strategy involve moving your body? My cousin is a tour guide and biologist, and most of his tours are in Africa. He instructed his group of 20 to 25 people, including kids, not to wear any type of earring or collars, especially shiny stuff, since they're about to go into a thick forest to try and see a bunch of animals. This is very important because 20 to 25 make a lot of noise, which makes wild animals run away or hide. It's even worse if they're wearing shiny stuff because the animals can spot that from far away. So this woman complains and decides to wear shiny earrings anyway. Cousin tells her to get rid of them or she isn't coming with the group, so she obeys but puts them on a little bit later. Some species of monkey in that area love shiny stuff. They ripped the earrings from her ears. When did you realize that your paid professional was an absolute moron? I told my old therapist I didn't want to see her anymore, and she told me that without her I wouldn't even have any friends. When the roofer didn't bring a ladder. I ordered new windows to be installed in my attic, and the salesman who came to my house said that it'll be 6 weeks tops to get them in. 3 months later, they were delivered. When I spoke to the representative on the phone that I was unhappy about how much longer it actually took, and that their salesman had said 6 weeks, she said, "Oh, well, of course he said that. He's a salesman." My bankruptcy attorney was convinced that taxes paid had to be counted as income. Not gross pay, mind you. For example, gross pay is $1,000. $300 is taken for taxes, meaning you had a $700 check. He insisted this meant there was $1,300 in income to report. His reasoning was that there was an area later on the form to deduct taxes, and if we used the pre-tax number of $1,000, then after the deducted taxes it would only show a $700 income, which is clearly not the case since I made $1,000. Ugh. "Oh, was I not meant to do that? I didn't look at what you booked in for, I just assumed this is what you wanted," said a woman who is no longer my hairdresser. Well, mine marked the wrong wrist before surgery. The current position I have is by no means an entry-level one. When I was hired, I had to go through a rigorous 6-week training program. The first 2 weeks, though, our instructor was part of this other program where someone with much lower credentials is allowed to teach initial training to the much more experienced class in order to eventually be given a job at the position we were all training for. Makes sense, right? Anyways, anytime we had questions about anything, this instructor would say the words, "You're all getting too far ahead. We're going to talk about this next week." It took 2 days for us to figure out that our instructor didn't know the material and had no business attempting to teach us. I don't really understand this training program, but if you ask this junior instructor in the first 2 weeks something over his head, surely he's allowed to say that it's not something he's been trained in yet? Like, is this not something that's overseen if you have trainee trainers giving the class? I broke my arm and went to an orthopedic office. I didn't like them from the first appointment because I'd had an appointment and they made me wait 2 hours. Then they had their secretary take my past medical history, which is extremely complex, in the waiting room. On a follow-up appointment, the tech removed my cast. PA came in to assess my arm and went to my non-broken arm, assessed strength and range of motion and swelling, and told me it seemed to be healing nicely. I told her, that's great, since that one was never broken. Once she finished repeating the process on the arm that was actually broken, she sent the tech in to recast my arm. I had to stop the tech from casting my non-broken arm. On my appointment paperwork, she wrote that she recommended I take ibuprofen for pain relief. That was exactly like 2 sentences after where it stated, NSAIDs, like ibuprofen, cause life-threatening airway swelling for me. The same office wanted to charge me $50 every visit to sign a form that was literally one checkbox saying if I was cleared or not for full duty at work. One checkbox, no research required. I never went back. I figured out pretty quickly that I didn't like my driving instructor, but other people's horror stories about changing made me stick with him. 6 months of lessons being told off for minor errors and having the test dangled in front of me, but just out of reach, he finally said to me, "I just don't think you're going to be able to drive a manual car." He said this knowing full well that I'd already bought a manual car because I didn't expect to be learning for so long. He wrecked my confidence in driving, and it took me another 6 months to try again, and my new instructor had to then correct all the bad habits the first guy had taught me. He had no issue with my use of gears at all, and I passed first attempt. Screw you, Nick. A plumber in the middle of a job that had to drive back to the shop to get a part that was pretty basic, and then charged me for the time it took to do that, and then installed it incorrectly, and then returned a week later to fix the mistake and asked what idiot installed it that way, and then installed it wrong an entirely new way. Hey, some people like me, some don't. This was a boast from a doctor I saw when I injured my shoulder, and he said it was all in my head. I went to my GP to get a prescription for birth control. I suggested an IUD might be something I want because I'm very forgetful and pills didn't work out in the past. She refused to prescribe an IUD because I was a virgin and she didn't want to take my virginity away by inserting an IUD. I'm currently looking for a new GP, by the way. My car insurance company had an agent who reviewed my policy with me and while trying to get me to sign on to life insurance, wanted me to get an amount that would pay off my student loans and have my parents set for life. My parents. She refused to listen even when I told her nobody even co-signed my loans and that I have no contact with my financially comfortable, horrible and healthy parents. I ended up writing a long email to the company, including wondering if they no longer wanted me as a customer. I took a job that sounded ideal on paper, but the CEO who I reported to gave off some very bad vibes very quickly. A lot of decisions he made were questionable at best. He wanted me to play clips from The Wolf of Wall Street to motivate the team, for example. But as soon as he told me he was altering people's targets midway through the month and withholding bonuses from certain team members, I was out of there. I was in the job for exactly 1 month, and on a Tuesday morning, I got into work and told him that I morally couldn't do it, and that if that was his decision, I didn't want to be part of it. 2 minutes later, I silently collected my things and left, feeling literally over the moon for doing so. I saw a doctor after a mental breakdown who told me I had anxiety, and then asked me if I'd tried not being anxious. I should specify that I only lost trust in this particular doctor. Once I changed doctors, I got a much better one. Although, to the other one's credit, while the comment wasn't helpful, they did recommend I see a psychiatrist. I dislocated my ankle and went to the hospital in an ambulance. When I got there, I was assessed and sent for x-ray. I got onto the bed and the tech started lining up the x-ray over my knee, so I told her I dislocated my ankle, not my knee, and she said that the chart said it was my knee. I replied that I'm pretty frickin' certain that the effed up foot that's hanging off is the problem, and that if she doesn't believe me, then to double check with the doctor because my knee is fine. She just kept repeating that if the chart says it's my knee, then that's what has to be x-rayed, and she's unwilling to double check. So, after a 2-hour wait for an x-ray, I went back to the doctor with pictures of my knee, and he was confused. So he goes to the x-ray tech and asks what the F she's playing at. She gives him the speech about how she just x-rays what it says on the chart. So he proceeds to chew her out, saying that if she's getting clearly conflicting information, then she has a duty to double-check to make sure she's doing the right thing. He said people make mistakes and this was an easy one to catch, but she's too much of a moron with no common sense to do anything about it. She was so angry at me as she took the x-ray of my ankle, saying I should have insisted she double-check, and I should have refused to do the x-ray until she did. That woman was completely incompetent. I was looking to hire an editor for one of my books last year. She corrected my grammar in the email I sent her. Quite politely, I have to say. I think she thought it was some kind of audition piece, but she was just factually wrong about the mistake. I think it was the use of a colon instead of a semicolon. When I sent her a link to a couple of web pages that showed that actually the way I'd typed it was correct, she doubled down, got extremely snippy with me, and basically came back with, "You're hiring me to do a job, so I know better than you." I was like, "Which? I've done your job in the past. I know editing is a skill and deserves respect, but I'm paying you because I don't want to do it, not because I can't do it." There's nothing so hilarious as someone being confidently wrong, is there? For the record, even as a man who's been told that he writes well and has exhaustively Googled the topic, I feel a sense of anxiety when I write a semicolon, like I'm only mostly sure that I know what I'm doing with those specific little jerks. When I was a teenager in high school, I really wanted to apply for an astronomy camp program that summer, and you needed a letter of recommendation from a math or science teacher. My higher grade was in chemistry, so I asked her. She said she would, but be aware that she'd have to say I don't always focus on my work as I should. I said, fine, that was true. I worked really hard on the rest of the application and I got in. Ran to school in excitement to thank my teacher for her letter, and she couldn't hide her look of utter astonishment, and I realized what was up. A few months later, when at that camp, I nonchalantly asked the director, "She wrote me a bad letter, didn't she?" He immediately pulled me aside to say yes. It was so bad that it was a full page saying terrible things about my character and scholarship, so he knew to discount it, but wanted to let me know. Which was in fact good to know because I had an AP chemistry with her the next year and she kept doing stuff like that, getting me sent to the principal's office for a B- at the quarter. That still bothers me a bit to this day. I was your classic bright but bored kid and was obsessed with astronomy, and any educator worth their salt knows a kid who can't get good grades in chemistry class can thrive at a summer program. If she didn't want to write me a letter, one can just say no, but spending all that time writing a bad one? Pretty low thing to do to a kid. I'm actually an astronomer today, so screw her, and I'm still in touch with the camp director and even work as a counselor some years when my schedule allows it. The same year I graduated, said teacher moved to New Jersey. I don't know where, and she had a very generic name, so no, I can't contact her or her employer, and I've no reason to believe that she isn't still teaching students today. Sad. My mom has always had amazingly manicured nails. She did them herself and they always looked perfect. I took her to many of her doctor's appointments as she got older and witnessed a nurse launch into her about the dangers of acrylic nails, especially for a diabetic like Mum. Mum told her, and I told her again and again, those aren't acrylic, they're just her nails. Yet she kept on telling Mum that she needed to get rid of the fake nails. I've never before witnessed such a stunning display of a complete failure to listen. You can submit your own stories to be featured here on the channel. The story submission link is in the description below, and if you want to listen to some vibey music in the background, check out easymode, also linked below, and subscribe. I was planning a kitchen renovation in the apartment building I used to live in, and I had a plumber in to give advice and estimates. I lived on the ground floor of a 5-story complex. I wanted to relocate the sink, and doing so would take it from one side of a structural column to the other. It was a wooden building, and these internal columns were typically 6 2x6s nailed together. I was trying to come up with a clever way to reroute the plumbing, and this guy just grinned and said, "Just cut through it and don't tell anyone." I smiled, thanked him for his time, and don't let the door hit your butt on the way out, pal. I went to my therapist once and told her about my depression and how I didn't want to be alive anymore. I explained how I couldn't bring myself to do things, even small things I used to love doing, because I just couldn't be bothered to live. She suggested I was just lazy. I tried to defend myself, but ultimately I just agreed because she wouldn't listen to me. Flash forward another few months, I finally told her my story of being attacked by my father, after not having told anyone about it my entire life, and after one half-hour session she said I should just be over it and to stop talking about it and move on. About 20 years ago, I had a well-known nurse practitioner who was married to one of the doctors in the practice. I'd developed a weird combination of symptoms along with a silent strep infection. Anyway, she came in telling me about people she knew, giving first and last names and asking if I knew them, and telling me about their strep infections and symptoms and stuff. That was the last time I made an appointment with her. I knew it was straight up illegal to talk about other people's medical conditions, and it made me wonder who she told about mine. Horrible, horrible woman who thought she was untouchable because she was well off and married to a doctor. I have a relative who's a plumber. My sister's sink got messed up somehow and he came over, looked at it, went to the store down the street and got a $5 replacement part and fixed it for her. He told her that he would have charged an actual customer around $300 for what he fixed and would have stayed under the sink for more than 30 minutes pretending to be busy. I don't trust plumbers at all anymore. High school guidance counselor here. I was talking to her about what schools I was applying to. I said, so I'm looking at these state and city schools as my backups, but I'm mostly looking at this private school because they send me… She scoffs, interrupting me. Honey, your family could never afford a private school. I pause and finish my sentence. A letter offering a full academic scholarship. You don't need shaded safety glasses, as I was staring into a 2,500-degree furnace. My professor said it's not her job to grade our papers correctly. You need a diet of 1,000 calories split into 5 small meals, no fat at all, and you need to do some video trainings with Male B, said a professional and certified sport dietitian whom I visited because I wanted to have a professional weightlifting training plan and diet. Stupid me actually tried to follow this diet for 3 months and stopped it after fainting several times during the day. This happened around the early 2010s in Poland. It turned out you don't need any certification to call yourself a dietitian here, or at least there was none back then. I was a petite girl who loves running, with no weight problems at all, and just wanted to find someone to introduce me to weightlifting. There were more red flags I skipped because I was young and naive, such as the dietitian office being in a shady part of town, and weird food restrictions like, you're only allowed 100 grams of meat per day. No eggs, no bread, no fruit at all. But if you need to make a cheat meal because you need to take your customers for a business lunch, then fine, eat whatever, but no carbs. Followed by some motivational bullcrap. I remember I lost about 3 kgs in my first week, and then the weight loss stopped. I regained 2 kilos back and was able to lose them again on a rational reduction diet made by an actual professional clinical dietitian I visited later. Oh gosh darn it! The narrator was aware that often nutritionists were full of crap and didn't need a qualification to call themselves such, but he kind of thought that dietitians were the ones that you could trust. Then again, this video is full of licensed medical professionals who are ignorant or just negligent as all hell, so maybe this is an example of a similarly qualified individual who was just bad at their job. Oh, the car salesman who said, you don't need to worry about these new diesel laws. We all drive diesels and it really won't change anything. 10 minutes later, he happened to slip in, oh, I drive an M3. I'd repeatedly gone to my GP about this nagging pain in my arm. He did some blood work to check for vitamin deficiency and sent me for an X-ray, which didn't show anything. He then decided my pain must be because I was an anxious female. On my last visit, I mentioned I'd also been struggling to breathe properly and had some chest pain and was starting to get quite concerned. He said, you're just anxious, but what do you have to be anxious about? You have a husband with a good job. And he sent me on my way with a prescription for Zoloft. 2 days later, I was in the ER being diagnosed with pulmonary embolism, and now I have a new doctor. At 17, I had a long history of migraines and then came down with a pretty severe vitamin D deficiency, which for some reason caused my migraines to come back after 4 years of having them under control. So I went with my mum to a neurologist. Our appointment was at 1:30 and my mum had a haircut appointment later at 5:30. So we get to the neurologist's office at 1 to fill out paperwork and stuff. We aren't called back until 4. When we get into the office, the doctor takes another 45 minutes to even show up. When he does, he isn't at all apologetic and starts saying that, based on my file, What I've been experiencing probably isn't migraines and they aren't a problem. Right off the bat, we could tell he's an arrogant jerk. After about 15 minutes of him questioning me and writing off my systems as a coincidence, what the frick, my mum says, "Look, we waited hours to see you and I've got other plans to get to tonight. Are you actually going to be helpful?" To which the doctor responds by nagging my mum into telling him what other plans she has. She says a haircut. Listen, woman, what's more important, your hair or your son's life? Considering the fact that he'd been completely disregarding everything that I was telling him about my headaches, it was apparent that my life didn't matter to him. Needless to say, we won't be going back to him again. A religious professional therapist once told me that the only reason I was depressed is because God was disappointed in me. Oh, thanks, man. I was going to self-delete last night, but I'm really glad I didn't so I could hear you say that. If you go on birth control and give up Johnnies, you'll become immune to pregnancy. Also, going to church will help treat your condition, said a pretty expensive OBGYN. When I was 23, I was hospitalized for an episode of acute pancreatitis. My doctor at the time was convinced I was an alcoholic. At the hospital, he asked me to tell him about my drinking. I told him I didn't drink, because I didn't. I was always the designated driver, I don't like drinking or feeling drunk. He sent my parents and grandparents away and then said, "Now you can tell me the truth. How much are you drinking?" I repeated the above. I don't drink. He got frustrated and left. The next few appointments when I offered up explanations for why I was getting pancreatitis, he belittled them and refused to listen to me or investigate further. When I asked how I could prevent another episode, he told me to eat carbs and stop drinking. No matter what I said, his solution was that I just needed to stop drinking. A year later, I was hospitalized again for another episode of pancreatitis. This time I was in another city. I told the doctor that my family has a history of cystic fibrosis, that my uncle and multiple cousins have cystic fibrosis, and pointed out the link between pancreatitis and cystic fibrosis. This doctor, unlike the first, listened to me and tested my DNA for CF markers. Guess why I got pancreatitis? I have the CF markers in my DNA and multiple CFTR-related conditions. Take that, idiot. I don't drink. I was frickin' right. I never saw the first doctor again, and I got everyone else in my family to see someone else as well. I took my kids to a local optician for years. I queried a few times with them about glasses as I felt they couldn't see very well as they were getting older. Some glasses were given, but they were only to wear them if they absolutely had to. So cue my kids not really wearing them at all. The advice was that this would strengthen their eyes and hopefully reverse their short-sightedness. I took them to the races. They couldn't see a thing, what horses were running, the boards with the winner placings on them, so I took them straight to a new optician who immediately gave them glasses and contact lenses for permanent use and who was horrified with the old optician's advice. Apparently your eyes get worse if you don't wear glasses when you're short-sighted, not better. I still don't understand how they were managing at school. My father had just passed away after deciding he didn't want to be alive anymore. I was 14. I really struggled to get through a full week of school. My attendance was pretty shocking. My psychiatrist said to my mum, "Don't worry, she doesn't need an education. She's pretty." This fueled my mum to get me right back into school. I frickin' love my mum. When a career motivator had a chat with me asking about what I wanted to do for the future, by the way, I was 18 and about to apply for uni, I said, mechanical engineering. But I didn't hold on the it was just like the natural you fit into any sentence. He then said in the most overconfident, condescending manner, "Nope, you stuttered, therefore you're not sure and this is not a career for you. Look elsewhere, son." Oh, gee, thanks, mystical man. I'ma just drop my plans for the next 40 years of my life over a stutter. By the way, I just made it into my dream uni for a mechanical engineering degree, so screw you, you basic YouTube motivation channel copycat hack. Veterinary clinic. "So, what's wrong with your cat?" I was holding a rabbit. Her face got really red afterwards. It was just most likely a brain toot. As an out for her, my wife had tried buying cat litter and cat food for the rabbit, until I reminded my wife that we had a rabbit. Maybe my rabbit just looks like a cat. I asked a doctor about medicine for a condition and she told me all about the power of faith and how it's so helpful to her. Last visit. Look, faith is an incredibly important part of people's lives and I have no problem with it, but when I'm paying for a doctor's visit, I want some gosh darn doctoring, with actual science and stuff. A dermatologist once told me that my psoriasis would go away if I dumped my girlfriend and quit my job. That isn't really an answer and it makes sense what the follow-up was. He prescribed me shampoo to fix my feet. He then argued with me about where my psoriasis was presenting. It was on my hands and feet, yet he insisted it was on my head under my hair. I am a bald man. When did you see an awesome mic drop moment in court? I had a client who was accused of taking a young woman's car and then crashing it and fleeing the scene. The girl testified at trial that she'd given him the keys that night because she was drunk and would never, ever drink and drive. Apparently, she wasn't aware that I'd requested and obtained a copy of her driving record, which showed she had received a DUI a month after the incident. I still remember the look on her face when I handed her driving record and said, "Except for that one time you got caught a month later, right?" The look on the judge's face was equally memorable. I can't remember exactly what he called her testimony, something along the line of absolutely not believable. There were quite a few other evidentiary issues that pointed to the possibility that someone else, perhaps an inebriated young woman, was driving the vehicle at the time of the accident. The client was acquitted. I trapped a defendant pretty badly one time. He testified in a deposition that he had a green arrow for his left turn and that my client ran the red. Unfortunately for him, the additional turn lane arrow was installed 2 months after the wreck. Case settled for policy limits a week later. During a deposition on a case where 2 former employees decided to start their very own company in a very niche market. The problem was how they did it, which was trying to poach existing clients while they were still employed with their old boss, which breached their fiduciary duty, particularly that of loyalty. I believe we also went after them for intentional interference with contract, as they weren't trying to solicit new clients for their business, but rather trying to get existing ones to break their contracts with our clients. They were dumb enough to make their plans on company laptops they later unsuccessfully tried to brick. Using the company laptop to try and do it just made it way easier to catch them when the company IT guy found all the emails. One of the defendants was the one being deposed. She said she answered to a higher power than the company. When I pressed her on what that meant, she said, myself. That got reused prominently at trial. I was reviewing the transcript of an interview with the child. The child made incriminating statements against my client. At one point, when discussing the allegations, the child used an odd word, but I didn't think too much of it. Then a few days later, I was watching a video of the child interacting with their grandmother, who hates my client, from about a week before that interview. The grandmother used the exact same odd word in the exact context the child later used it. At that moment, it became clear that child had been coached. It was the first real, aha! moment of my career. Yes, I was about to say that I'm imagining the iconic Phoenix Wright pose for the majority of these stories. Let's see what other juicy evidence dumps we have in store. I worked on a case involving defective processors. They were in an Asian country, but the emails were all in English because they were going to US executives. One of the more senior engineers basically laid out the exact defect we were suing over, explaining what the problem was and why it was their fault, and finishing it with, "This is a big problem. We ship crap to customer." Needless to say, we hit them over the head with that in mediation, and they settled shortly after. My client has been keeping her son away from the father because the father has a new child. She's concerned that her son will act violently towards the new child and she could be held liable. The judge said, "That's not even a defense." I was in small claims court. My lease had an exit clause that said if I fronted 2 months' rent, they would work to lease my place and return anything unused. I checked with the office ahead of time. They ensured me that there was a waiting list, so I gave them the 2 months and moved. They never returned a dime. I talked to the new tenant and confirmed they moved in a week later. In court, the judge was commenting on how he didn't see anything explicitly saying they'd return any unused rent, even though that intent was stated to me a few times. Dumbo from the leasing office piped in with, "Your Honor, in almost every case we can return some money, but in this case we didn't have a tenant in the 2 months after he left." So, she gave the case back to me and I presented the affidavit from the new tenant confirming the move-in date. Judge awarded me double the amount that they owed. Turned out, leasing office Dumbos 1 and 2 thought they could lie to me and return my excess rent money to themselves. It was my 3rd month of practice. I was in family law at the time, representing a mom in a petition for a restraining order against the boyfriend/dad. At issue in the broader case was child visitation, custody, support, a few other things, but today's hearing was just on the restraining order. We had pretty good facts, but it was mostly based on testimony of the parties. My client was way more reputable as witnesses go, so I was feeling confident. 10 minutes before the hearing, my client shows up. I give her a last-minute prep on what to expect, and then she says, "I'm glad I'm going through with this. I can't deal with it anymore and he's just getting worse. To top it off, he left me a drunken, ranting voicemail on Saturday. I paused a moment. Do you have your phone with you? Yes. We play the voicemail and it's a full 2 minutes of ex-boyfriend screaming crap like, "I should have frickin' killed you when we were together. You were always such a B-word. I hope you burn to death in a fire." I didn't have time to ask her why the F she hadn't said anything to me about the voicemail before the bailiff called our case. We sit, the judge asks if either side has additional evidence, and I ask for permission to play the voicemail. Ex-boyfriend, who didn't have an attorney, didn't object, so I played the whole nasty 2-minute rant in open court. The judge goes, "We're going to take a brief recess before I issue my ruling. If the parties want to meet and confer in the hall, they're welcome to." The boyfriend knew he was screwed. We settled the whole damn case then and there. My client got her wish list in terms of custody, supervised visitation, child support, plus the restraining order to boot. I'm a trial lawyer. I have a ton of these. My favorite was probably a DUI where the cop was in Buffalo Wild Wings with my client watching a fight. Like the cop was standing at the bar in full uniform, then when my client walked by him to leave, followed him out. The client was only actually going to his car to grab his phone charger because he was going home with the bartender. Like he hadn't even closed his tab yet. The cop arrested him and charged him with DUI for opening his car door, then fabricated the story for his report about how the client got in the car, turned it on and began to pull out of the space to leave the parking lot. He also denied being inside the Buffalo Wild Wings, on the stand, under oath, to my face. Surprise, I talked to the bartender at the wings joint and got the security tape. It very clearly, like surprisingly good quality, don't try to steal from a Buffalo Wild Wings by the way, showed the cop standing at the bar, watching my client walk out the front door, then follow him 30 seconds later. The parking lot cam also showed the client barely touched the door handle before the cop stopped him. I'll add the cop underwent an internal review where the board determined he hadn't done anything wrong. Then a few months ago he killed an unarmed man while on patrol. He also trains new cops now and tells young college girls he pulls over to call him Tommy. My moment was when I compared the scanned copy of the deed provided by the other side's lawyers to the original my client eventually got around to providing. The scanned copy provided by the other side had a witness signature. The original did not. You know, it's been a while since the narrator provided his usual quote that can honestly be the moral lesson of any video that contains a certain amount of tenant-landlord disputes. Keep every bit of potential evidence from your tenancy. You never know when you'll need them. Years ago, I had to do something at a strip mall in a bad part of town. It took me about 20 minutes and then I found that my car had been towed. Ubered to the tow yard, a giant sign says cash only. I had to call another Uber, drive to the ATM and back and pay them $300. Got a crappy handwritten receipt that, believe it or not, was itemized. I went home, Googled, found that they violated the law in 3 separate ways. They towed illegally refused to accept credit cards, and had multiple charges that the law called unreasonable, like dolly fees and load and unload fees. I took them to small claims court. The judge began by asking the tow yard owner about his relationship with the property owner and how the decision was made to tow my car. "Oh," the slimy tow truck guy answered, "my cousin works there. If he says I tow, I tow. It's 100% legal." The judge's eyebrows began to rise. "But," the guy continued, "but what I detest the most, Your Honor, is this jerk claiming I don't take credit cards. I'm a businessman. I take credit cards all the time. He's a lowlife that doesn't have any credit cards. That's why he wanted to pay cash." I was having a "hold it" overload, and the judge saw me smiling and hopping in my seat and putting my manila folder of receipts on the table. "Do you actually not have any credit or debit cards?" the judge asked me. I pulled out my wallet and showed him, and then I pulled out a time-stamped photo of the cash-only sign I took the day of and another one I took the morning of the hearing. The guy mumbled something like, "Okay, you got me there," and then had nothing but, I didn't know that," when the judge asked him about the legality of each unreasonable itemized charge. Anyway, each violation pays double the tow charge, and since there were 3, that's how I made $1,800 on a $300 investment. My client was accused of brutally murdering a dog. A cop testified that there was no testing of the blood, no body ever found, and admitted that it could have in fact run away. The eyewitness said she could see the killing down the hallway from the dining room. The cop testified there was no hallway and the dining room was on a different level of the house than the killing supposedly took place in. Then the person who was leading the lynch mob against my client around town for the last year testified that she had been in the apartment between the 2 visits by the cop to evaluate the scene. No body, a compromised crime scene, witness who couldn't see anything, and admission that there was no proof the dog was dead. Closing argument lasted 3 seconds. Your Honor, I'm asking for an acquittal. My mum hit a guy on her bike with her car in a parking lot. She claimed he hit her, she also wanted to countersue the cyclist for scaring her, and in her deposition she started every sentence with, "Well, when I hit him, Mum." You can submit your own stories to be featured here on the channel. The story submission link is in the description below, and if you want to listen to some vibey music in the background, check out easymode, also linked below, and subscribe. A friend of mine was a DWI attorney in New York for a while. He was defending a guy who was asleep in the back seat of his car while intoxicated, and a New York State trooper arrested him. On the stand, the trooper testified that he visually saw the key in the ignition. My friend gave him like 3 chances to walk it back. "Are you sure, trooper, that you actually saw the key in the ignition?" "Yes, counselor." When a cop calls a lawyer counselor, he really means butthole. And then my buddy dropped the hammer. "You are aware that my client drives a Toyota Prius. They use fobs to start the car, not keys." Bam. We had no evidence that the woman who slammed into my stopped car going 85 miles per hour was drunk until she indignantly admitted it on tape in her deposition. She busted into my deposition and demanded she go first because I was a lying B-word. She excitedly told my lawyer that the police report was wrong because it said she was coming from the movie theater when she was actually coming from her friend's bar. "Did you have anything to drink at your friend's bar?" "Of course." "How many drinks?" "I don't know, they just keep my glass full." "Did you take any medication that day?" "Methadone and low blood pressure medicine." "I see." The cops had refused to have her breathalyzed at the scene because her husband was a firefighter that they knew personally. They just told her to go home, sober up, and go to the hospital later. I heard the whole thing but had no proof until she handed it to me. They settled same day. One of my friends got hit by a car when crossing the street at a crosswalk on foot. This was back when we were in high school. The guy tried to sue him for the damages to his car. At one point, the lawyer called up my friend's mum and asked her for the son's insurance information and pictures of the damage of her son's car. She explained that my friend was on foot and the lawyer just went silent for a bit. He said, "I need to speak with my client," and hung up. He called back a few minutes later and told her that she wouldn't be hearing about this again. I clerk for a judge and we had a low-level thief in our courtroom who had robbed one of his neighbor's houses in the winter in Colorado, and all the police had to do was follow the footsteps back to his house, where he was hanging out with the stolen items and a small amount of substances and a broken gat. Idiot. This is why there are so few domestic burglaries in the Nordic countries. It's nothing to do with the fact that they're better behaved up there. There's just a frickin' trail in the making between any 2 given points that someone could conceivably rob and or hide in. I got a hidden shout-out from a federal judge in a ruling that I considered to be one of the highest points of my career. Here's what happened. Before a hearing for an emergency injunction against the USDA, I was watching the hearing before mine, a trademark infringement case. At the end of that hearing, the judge accidentally used a pun and couldn't stop laughing. She was literally crying. I decided at that moment I was going to intentionally use a pun in my hearing. I did. I accused USDA of engaging in a shell game by illegally diverting some federal funds to an egg industry trade group. The judge called me out on it but laughed heartily. My client won. The judge threatened to put the Secretary of Agriculture in jail. A major newspaper reporting on the case said the judge winced at my puns but agreed with my arguments. False. When the written ruling was issued, the last sentence said that an injunction was issued against the USDA's use of funds for any plans they may have been hatching. Undeniable shout-out. Oh, so this is my mum's story. She was fighting for custody on behalf of a father, trying to prove that the kids were living in subpar conditions with their substance-addicted mother in spite of the ample child support provided. It was a tough case because courts are so hesitant to pull kids away from their mums. Then the mum burst out that she had been feeding the kids cat food as proof that she wouldn't let them starve. Needless to say, the judge didn't take that as a good reason for the kids to stay with their mum. I tried to sell my home myself, and the buyers wanted a term period for land contract before getting their own mortgage. I agreed to 1 year, had a simple contract drawn up, and after, we both signed it and everything seemed fine. Within 30 days, they presented me with their own legally drawn-up land contract that was pages long to, quote, protect their investment. About page 3, it very clearly stated that, if for any reason the home burns down, the purchaser will receive all insurance proceeds. First, I still had a mortgage and the proceeds would legally go to pay that off. Second, that's a pretty targeted thing to say. Not lawyers' terms of the house being destroyed, and it's surrounded by woods and waterways, just if it burnt down. Page 4 stated that this would remain a land contract until my mortgage was paid in full, so they'd never buy outright. I returned it to them with a letter stating these two things were never happening and I wasn't signing. They stopped paying, so I began eviction. 6 months later, the lawyer I hired was an idiot and I was sitting down with their lawyer myself. He brings out the contract that they'd tried giving me and began talking about their ironclad case due to the agreement. I asked him to show me my signature. The look on his face when he realized it wasn't on there. After we talked, it turned out that he knew them and wrote the contract without the burn the house down stipulation. It seems they added that, and under the belief it was a long-term land contract. Not only did I win, I'm pretty sure they lost a lawyer friend in the process. I represented myself in court. I got a parking ticket and contested it due to misleading signs. Took a bunch of pictures and brought them to court. The judge agreed and dismissed the case. Hold up, what about the towing fees? I asked as he was about to read the next case. I got those back too. I'm currently in a custody battle. Mother is saying I can't be trusted because I've been refusing to take our child to the therapist. The therapist testified I couldn't bring our child in because therapy must have both parents' consent, and the mother has retracted consent. Okay, this is very abbreviated, but I was prosecuting a convenience store owner for luring a young girl, who regularly came to the store, back to a part of the store for sinister purposes, child enticement. It was the only section of the store without surveillance camera coverage. They were in the back room for about 2 minutes and 17 seconds, per the timestamp on the videos. Of the many arguments the defense put on, one was that there was no way there was enough time for anything to happen. In my rebuttal on closing, I asked the jury to imagine what could happen in the room in that amount of time, and I asked them to close their eyes while I timed out 2 minutes and 17 seconds on my watch, in silence. After about 60 seconds, 2 of the jurors started crying. I knew it was going to be guilty right then. My client was riding his motorcycle in a relatively calm street when this guy exited his garage, without looking, and ran over him. In deposition, the guy brought a witness that was with him on the passenger seat. The whole time, the witness maintained that my client was driving too fast and that there was no time to brake the car. I asked him the same question a few times in different ways, making him tell the story again. In the fourth telling, he was already a bit frustrated and let it slip. Look, I've already told you, we were exiting the garage, and as soon as I lifted up from getting my cell phone on the car's carpet, wait, so you didn't see the crash? There was no coming back from that. I knew the cops beat up my client and framed him. They described a knife in his possession that caused them to fear for their safety. Oddly, they never seized it. We won the criminal case and filed the civil rights case. While deposing one of them, he described the knife in detail. No more than 3 minutes later, he slipped up and claimed his partner told him my guy had a knife, but he never saw it himself. I told him, "That's not what you just said," and I saw him panic. His lawyer panicked too and asked to see me outside. When we got in the hallway, I withdrew my settlement demand and the case settled for a substantially larger amount within 45 minutes. Man, there are a lot of stories of power-mad cops here, aren't there? And from follow-up stories, it seems like guys like this are rarely held accountable beyond a, quote, investigation into their conduct that simply makes them more careful in choosing their victims next time. The plaintiff was being deposed in the lawsuit she filed alleging gender-based discrimination. She was claiming her boss had made some inappropriate innuendos and overtures. The defense attorney asked her when the alleged statements or events took place. Was she shocked? No. Was she offended? No. Was she damaged in any way? No. So why exactly are we here? Well, honestly, I'd rather not be. Meanwhile, her attorney stared straight down, scribbling notes and doodling. We ended the deposition there and asked her attorney if this was going away now. We got a call later offering to settle for $1,000 and a letter of apology. My best guess is that she was pressured by a friend or family to talk to an attorney, and the lawyers ran with it without really talking to their client. So I filed this lawsuit in January. We exchanged discovery, where each side sends questionnaires and gets carefully worded answers, over the next few months, and then I filed a motion for summary judgment, meaning I'm asking the court to let me win the case without a jury because the case is so obvious. Right before I file this motion, I figure let's review the discovery materials and see if there's anything I've missed. And what do you know, the other side made a massive mistake on literally just the 4th out of the 100 questions that I asked. It's a dog bite case, and every single time I asked about the bite, the response says something along the lines of, We admit to this and that, but we deny that our dog was involved in any dog attack. Well, question 4 asks whether they admit that their dog was not leashed on the day when it bit my client, and they simply answer, admit, meaning they admit their dog wasn't leashed and they admit that their dog was the one that bit my client. That was the one thing that was genuinely in dispute. They tried to argue at the hearing that it was a mistake and they only meant to admit the lack of a leash, but the judge held them to their word, most likely because the other evidence made it clear that it could only have been their dog anyway. My attorney had this moment in my initial consultation with him for my boating while intoxicated charge. Yes, boating. BUI. The sheriff's department conducted the field sobriety tests on the deck of their small vessel in a heavily traveled waterway rather than taking me to dry land. The charges were thrown immediately out after my attorney brought this to the attention of the DA. Parent termination case I was prosecuting in. The dad went on about how he had changed his life around and worked the AA program. I asked him what step he was on and he proudly proclaimed Step 3. I asked him what Step 3 is and he had no idea. Then I asked him Step 2. Again, no idea. Parental rights terminated. When did you have to deal with a ridiculous compulsive liar? Oh boy, in middle school I had a friend who claimed he had a special-made Nintendo 64 that supported 8 players. We asked if we could all come over and play and he made up excuses. The tenants at the place where I work lie about things they do all the time and stick by their story even if you have all the evidence in the world to the contrary. Like these really trashy people we had. Their apartment looked like an episode of Hoarders. They were throwing trash out their windows, like it took me several trips with a large trash can to get all of it. Of course, they said it's not them, it must be the neighbors. Well, A, their neighbors have been out of town for weeks, B, the trash was in a big pile under their windows, not their neighbors', and C, we found multiple pieces of mail with their names and addresses on them, their old driver's license and their old library cards in the pile of trash as well. They still denied doing it. I've probably got dozens of lying tenant stories. One set lied about everything, but most couldn't be proven wrong. One spring we had 3 straight days of steady rain flooding many buildings in low-lying areas, as well as basements everywhere. This tenant called me to tell me several TVs and other electronic devices she'd stored in the basement were ruined due to water that was a foot deep down there. By the time I got there, the water had receded and the floor was only damp. She swore the water was almost to her knees and wanted my insurance to cover her losses. I had her bend down with me in front of the natural gas furnace and asked her what she saw. She was quiet when she realized that the pilot light was still burning, about an inch off the ground. Some kid my little cousin was dating said he was a Marine platoon sergeant whose convoy was once blown up and he was the only survivor, so he was discharged and given a Purple Heart and has PTSD. He was 16 at the time. A girl in my high school really blew me away with the things she thought we'd believe. My favorite was probably the story about the time that a cop cornered her and told her to put her hands against the wall. Lucky for her, it was one of those secret spinning walls like in the movies, so she ran down the secret passage and got away. I was about to say you should be more careful about immediately dismissing people's testimony about police abusing their power against women. Then we got the Indiana Jones wall bit and I went, okay, maybe you can dismiss that story. This woman I work with spouts off 100 pointless lies a day about her life. I can only guess because she thrives on excitement and attention, because all you can really do is roll your eyes at the crap she says. Like she said she got a $3,000 check from a lawsuit against Red Bull, that her tires are warranted for 150,000 miles because her friend works at a mechanic shop, and that her landlady gives her free rent all the time because she loves her so very much. Even one time she told me that she bought $500 worth of wacky tobacco and that it was rainbow-colored from Jamaica. Then the next day she said ants got in the bag and ate it all. The funniest part is no one's asking her about this stuff. She's just going up to everyone throughout the day and telling them all about it to make sure you heard her story. I went to school with a girl who told the most unbelievable and dramatic lies. She told people she was a Victoria's Secret model, that she owned a restaurant in Chicago, owned a color iPod mini in every color to match her outfits. I had to room with her for the DC trip. I'd just moved there and didn't know anyone. And we all got in an extremely dramatic fight that ended with her building a bed out of chairs in the bathroom and calling security. She was something. Oh, and because I really think it's funny, one time she told me she was a professional singer and that she was recording an album. Then she leaned over like she was going to tell me a secret and sang my name into my ear. Yes, Once I had a friend in high school who was constantly lying about things. There's quite a few examples, but one situation stands out to me the most. She'd been talking on and off about her parents getting divorced, which I actually thought might have been true. She said that her dad was already seeing someone else, that they'd moved into this fancy subdivision area, and that she hated her new stepmom. Now, it all seemed to have happened quickly, but it didn't seem that weird, until I spent the night at her house. When I got there, what I knew to be her dad's car was in the driveway. I said, "Is that your dad's car?" And she said, "Oh wow, he's so bold, why would he just come here?" So we headed inside. I was feeling like the next few minutes were going to be awkward, so I just headed to her room. But I can still hear everything in her living room. Here's the exact scene. My friend yelling, "What is your deal? You call yourself a dad? You can't just show up whenever you please and then go to your other—" Dad interrupting in a very confused tone, "What are you talking about?" Her mum joins in, "Honey, what's going on?" "Go to your other family, and Mom, I can't believe you're allowing this. Leave, Dad, leave!" My friend storms down the hallway to her room where I am. As she reaches the door, she says, "I'm so sorry about that. I'm just sick of him showing up when he pleases." Meanwhile, we can still hear her parents in the living room. Dad says, "Okay, seriously, what was that?" Mum says, "Just another day with Elsie, I guess." I felt so awkward that I didn't even question her about it. I had a friend in middle school who went to a different high school. We still Skyped every so often, and he told me about his good fortune at his new high school. Top of the class, 34 on the ACT, has a girlfriend named Jane. So, flash forward to college, I end up in the same class as some girl who went to the same high school as this friend did. I ask her if she knows him. She says he stalked her in high school and wouldn't leave her alone. Her name? Jane. I've since wondered if anything he told me was true. I like that he got a 34 on the ACT. Isn't the best score 36? You've got to draw the line somewhere, I guess. A person at my school told me that when he used to live in Scotland, he had 7 girlfriends at the same time. Another person told me that the area he used to live in was a rough area and that he was shot while living there. Then, when asked to see the wound, he said he forgot where he was shot. Co-worker at Papa John's when I worked there said that he had a black belt in Aikido because he took 2 classes and then beat the teacher, and the teacher was so impressed that he awarded him his belt, then flew a fighter jet and had PTSD from seeing combat, he wouldn't specify what location, that he had several girlfriends in different locations that he frequently traveled to, or that he hadn't dated anyone except that one perfect girl who cheated on him with a substance addict, that he was an expert hacker, that he'd been kidnapped by the mob in New York that one time, and wouldn't elaborate further. There was a bunch more, but these are the only ones I really remember. They were all ridiculous. He'd get really vague or start making up conflicting details when he was pressed. Keep in mind, this guy was like 19 to 20 and was very nerdy/scrawny, the kind of thin that you get from sitting around doing nothing, not working out or being in the military or whatever. A guy in high school would tell us all about how he was super mechanically inclined and worked on motorbikes and cars. He was so good that the owner of the shop that he supposedly worked at gave him some old beat-up muscle car that was so broken that no one could fix it. He got it working and restored, but apparently it was too nice to drive to school. His boss took such a liking to him that he let him move into one of the many houses he owned. The house had a pool, and he and his friends would take turns jumping into the pool from the roof. Apparently, his boss also encouraged him to date his daughter, who promptly moved in with him. After only 2 weeks, he proposed after he took her out in a canoe filled with roses and got her a Tiffany engagement ring, all purchased with his mechanic job. We were 16, by the way. A girl I went to school with told people that her aunt married a snake. I'll never forget that. I also have an ex who would vehemently deny she was cheating. I could have caught her in the act and she'd still try to convince me that she didn't do it. I now refer to her as Shaggy. A friend of mine got lucky after bragging to a girl about being an underwater firefighter. Our other friend backed him up by saying that he was an underwater welder and he had his life saved multiple times by said friend. I mean, these are both actual jobs that exist, but if anything, that wingman move kind of removes any credibility they have. Because underwater firefighters get called in for major problems, they don't just sit next to underwater welders on the off chance that one of them has an accident. In any case, more of a weird pickup than a proven compulsive liar. Was in a gaming clan once where some guy was always trying to one-up people in terms of getting all the attention in the channel. We'd talk about the boxes of Titan X GPUs at his house, or that Nvidia was working on new graphics cards that only he knew about. Then he was a pro game developer that worked on all of this stuff, and he had all of these connections in the industry, despite living in the middle of West Virginia. Then he tried telling people that he had terminal illness and was going to die in a month, but people knew him in real life, and yeah. I left the group since then, so it's been a year and a half since I've heard from anyone. But his name alone used to be a running joke for telling BS stories. My friend in 3rd grade informed me that she was pregnant, and it was for that reason that her belly was sticking out. I told her that you have to have whoopee to get pregnant. She said, "Not always." She always told me that the Backstreet Boys were her cousins. I grilled her on Backstreet Boy trivia, literally just asking if she knew their names, and she couldn't answer any of it. The idea that she thought all of the Backstreet Boys were related is hilarious to me. You can submit your own stories to be featured here on the channel. The story submission link is in the description below, and if you want to listen to some vibey music in the background, check out easymode, also linked below, and subscribe. So, there's this guy named Michael. Michael is, as near as anyone can tell, a pathological liar. He's one of those fellows who has to trump everyone's story with one of his own, and somehow, he always winds up being an insanely attractive action hero in these stories. I've heard Michael talk about how he was issued access to a fighter jet at age 17, how he once saved the president from some plot or another, and how he had an impromptu ménage à trois with some very famous celebrity and her sister in the Sacramento River. Suffice to say, the guy isn't exactly believable, but perhaps his worst lie was one that took an entire evening to tell. In the town where I grew up, there used to be a weekly event called the Chef's Market. Since there wasn't a whole lot else to do in the area, my friends and I would frequently spend our Friday evenings there, wasting what little money we had on slabs of barbecued meat and cups of too sweet lemonade. On one such occasion, a local party coordinator had set up an inflatable stage of sorts, on which 2 contestants were encouraged to knock each other off low platforms using weapons that looked like rather enormous Q-tips. It seemed like a lot of fun, so I offered to pay for any of my friends who wanted to spar against me. "Oh, I can't," Michael chimed in before anyone else could talk. "It's okay," I said. "I'll pay for you if you want." Truth be told, I was hoping he'd decline so that I could pay for one of my other friends to try it with me. Fortunately, that's exactly what happened. Michael shook his head. "No, I'm very opposed to violence unless it's absolutely necessary." "This isn't violence," one of my other friends said. "It's just fun." "You guys don't understand," protested Michael. "If I go in that ring with you, I will kill you. I won't have a choice." A few eye rolls were passed around the group. "Why's that, Michael?" someone asked. "It's by training," he said. "Once I get into a combat state, I can't stop until I've killed someone." Now, Michael was clearly not someone that we spent much time around by choice, and none of us were too keen on talking him into an activity that he was clearly afraid of trying. My other friends and I went a few rounds, knocked each other down a few times, and figured we'd head off to find a drink. As soon as we started walking, though, Michael started into the next leg of his story. "Do you guys know why I have that training?" he asked. "Because you're a ninja?" someone sarcastically replied. Michael nodded. "Yes. I was trained in kung fu from a very young age, and I got so good that my family got run out of the last town where we lived." Nobody said anything. We certainly didn't ask him to continue, but he did anyway. "They even hatched a plot to try and get me thrown into prison. This girl broke into my house one night and tried to seduce me, but I already had a girlfriend, so I turned her away. That's when she went to the police and tried to say that I'd committed the unspeakable act on her." "How terrible," someone muttered. "Don't encourage him," hissed someone else. Michael's voice took on a very grave aspect. "Fortunately, I was friends with the owner of the hospital. He helped me after I accidentally killed my karate teacher." Someone made a comment about the difference between karate and kung fu, but Michael either didn't hear them or pressed onward anyway. "He tested the girl himself, and he found the genetic material in her hoo-ha, but it wasn't mine, and it wasn't human." He waited for a reaction. When it didn't come, he escalated even further. "That started a rumor that I was a genetically engineered super soldier because of how powerful I am. We had to leave town for my parents' safety because I couldn't always be there to protect him." Once again, nobody said anything save for a few murmurs of, yeah. Thankfully, Michael seemed to have exhausted himself for the evening until he asked one of us to pay for his dinner. No one was really surprised when he had a really insane reason for being broke. In short, a genetically engineered super soldier had to flee with his parents after being accused of both the unspeakable act and murder. And that's why he needs you to pay for his burrito. I used to work in restaurants years ago with a girl that insisted that in order to cure her brother of his fear of cats, the doctor tied him to a fence and threw cats at him until he was cured. She was like 25 and seriously thought that we all believed her. She was entertaining, to say the least, and while she drove us crazy with her stories, I do occasionally miss listening to them. My little sister had a friend in elementary school that said she had an underground pool with 100 dolphins living in it. The sister was angry when I called the girl a compulsive liar. My sister didn't draw the line until the friend said she had a cell phone. Apparently that one was unbelievable. This was in the mid-90s, by the way. I know a guy, I'll call him Phil because that's his name. He's 5'8", 280 pounds, runs the quarter mile in 8.2 seconds, bench presses 610 pounds with his bare hands, and has bowled over 3,000 perfect games in a row, so that's what we know about him so far. He was a SEAL Ranger for over 15 years, but had to leave the army because he was just too deadly, apparently, so he became a ninja until the US called him back down to hunt down Noriega. His hands are registered deadly weapons, and he'll be killed by the FDA if he ever reveals who he really is. He once went to Universal Studios to see the Conan the Barbarian show, and almost didn't make it back because they thought he was the perfect Conan, but he had to turn it down because he was going to be the next senior project manager at work. He showed me a framed picture of him as Conan, or rather him as Arnold Schwarzenegger as Conan. Oh, and that bottom right-hand corner under the picture wasn't a page number, that's how much they offered him, but without the 12 zeros. Wow, Phil sure seems like a cool, rad person who's achieved a lot. No way that any of that is bullcrap. What the hell? I love being so committed that you try to pass off a page number as literally anything else. Do compulsive liars actually think that other people are this gullible? I can understand having a compulsion to just say stuff like this, but does it also make you think everyone else is a complete drooling idiot who can't tell fact from fiction? Used to have a friend who was a pathological liar by every sense of the word. Some of his highlights include being the heir to a large corporate fortune. He said his grandmother owned a VIP box at a large commercial sports venue, that he was a personal friend of Hillary Clinton, graduated with honors from a prestigious university, which in reality he attended one semester, that he was a high-ranking employee of several political campaigns, Gloria Allred was apparently his personal lawyer, mother was a founding member of AITA, sister was a backup dancer for Lady Gaga, he receives a monthly special benefit from the state for being adopted. I'm 99% sure this was an EBT card, which somehow we're the heir to a large corporate fortune as well. Mother graduated Harvard Law with and is a close friend of Justice Kagan. Mind you, this is just the crap I can confirm is false. There's a much longer list of things that I'm pretty sure are false, as well as things that would be too identifying to share. Oh, I had this one friend in college. Most of his tales were these ridiculous cinematic conquests, sounding like something straight out of a badly written adult film, all of which had apparently taken place since he entered college 3 years ago. Ménage à trois with hot cheerleaders, doing the deed with a hot, older professor, doing it in public, the list just went on like that. It was obvious he took all the things that he liked in adult movies and just made up stories involving himself, and he'd only tell these stories in public because he wanted random people to hear it. Met a guy who claimed that at age 14 he worked at medieval times and was one of the knights. He claimed he was the youngest knight in the history of medieval times, and that one day when he was walking from his car wearing a full suit of armor, because apparently they let you take it home, he got struck by lightning. I was in the Navy, so I had a ton of these. Tons and tons and tons and tons. But the first guy was the one that really stole my heart. We were in boot camp together, and I don't remember his name. Jake, maybe? I don't know. He was from Iowa, where his parents were apparently millionaires because in his small town they were accountants. To all the billionaires in town. Their small Iowa town had quite a few billionaires, apparently. That's how he got money, too. He owned a dozen cars and he had 30 weapons in his collection. When he chose to join the Navy as an undesignated enlisted, he got that hookup from his uncle, who was a senator. Former senator. He spent all of his summers growing up with this guy. But this guy had died the previous year and had already forgotten his name, I guess. But they were apparently really close, that's why he got in as an undesignated seaman. Also, his other uncle, I think, was an admiral. The nukes wanted him, what with his perfect 99 on the ASVAB, and so did the SEALs. He had apparently used to train with a bunch of them, in Iowa, but his uncle got him the hookup as an undesignated seaman, so that's what he was going to do, try everything before picking the one job he wanted. And he already had the hookup from his uncles, including the dead one whose name he can't remember, and the living one whose name he can't remember, so he was going to be stationed in Australia as an undesignated seaman. He had one guy that actually did believe all of this crap. Though I will say, the most common lie was about ASVAB scores. I don't get it, it's technically private, but everyone knows someone who has access to that info to easily prove or disprove someone's claims. I'd say the entire command knew the top and bottom 5 ASVABs at any given time without them being appropriately shifted as people moved in and out of the command. You can't lie about something that everyone knows. Yep, when I was in high school my sophomore year, this girl wrapped an ace bandage around her chest and colored on it with a red Sharpie and said that she had been shanked by MS-13. I used to work on cruise ships, and there was this stand-up comedian who was an insane liar. He told us all kinds of bullcrap about how he was once the voice of Donald Duck, but he got fired for doing an impression of Donald, climaxing that ended up going viral on the internet. He also said he'd been on Letterman. He hadn't, maybe in the audience, but never on the actual show. The best lie he told me was when we were in the crew bar. My hometown had just gotten their NHL team back, so I was proudly rocking a new Winnipeg Jets hat. He proceeded to tell me that he played for the original Winnipeg Jets in the 90s. I was like, which I lived and breathed the Jets in the 90s and I never saw your butt on any of our teams. He then goes on to say that he was originally a soccer player at St. Louis and he got drafted by the Blues when the GM was at one of his games. This, he says, was right around the time the Blues team was formed, in the 1980s. The frickin' Blues have been in the NHL since 1967. He was dead frickin' serious when he told me all of this. I just sat there in shock wondering how the frick he could possibly think I'd believe any of it. Then a few days later, he was busted in his cabin with a crap ton of white snow. So I guess I got my answer. There was a girl in middle school that would just lie about being rich. The only ones I specifically remember was that she only gave her cat Evian water and said that her dad was a doctor and drove a Porsche. I didn't care either way, but one day after school I paid attention to what car she got into. I can still see her panicked face as she realized I was watching her get into a rinky-dink Toyota Corolla. What's the worst way you've seen an employee screwed over by the company? We had RIFs, or reductions in force, back in 2008 when they started in February in the Midwest. One girl was escorted out of the secure area, told she was gone and to leave the building. She was okay with being RIFed, however it's February in the Midwest and it's cold outside. All of her stuff was inside the secure area and they wouldn't allow her back in. They wouldn't get her stuff for her. So she had to stand out in 20 degrees Fahrenheit weather until someone she knew would call a buddy to get her hat, coat, purse, and car keys. I worked for an oil company and lived through mass redundancies when the oil went belly up. They sent out a list of positions which were being made redundant with numbers for how many people currently held that role and how many they were cutting it to. So for example, if it said buyers current 4, consultation 3, you knew that if you were a buyer, you'd be under scrutiny and 25% of your team would be gone soon. I sat at my desk and opened the email. Looked for my position and no redundancy for me. The girl next to me opened hers and saw position, current, 1, consultation, 0. That's how she learned she'd lost her job. Oof, I can think of 2 examples. There was a fire drill, and upon returning, it was discovered that not everybody returned. Apparently, it was a literal fire drill where some people were told that they'd been let go, and this was their way of having them leave the building. The other example is my dad, who'd been with a huge multinational company that tried to fire him a week or so before his 30-year work anniversary. Fortunately for him, the manager forgot to give him the necessary paperwork on time, and he was fired but made it to the 30-year mark, which has extremely heavy implications on pension and retirement. Was that on purpose? I hope your manager intentionally forgot to give your dad the paperwork until the 30-year mark. It was not a favor where the paperwork was intentionally delayed. My dad and the manager butted heads, and the manager was part of the sweep to force out the older, costlier employees. My dad knew that the retirement package was coming and required, and opted to not remind the manager. In the end, he got really lucky that the management was determined to force him out but failed to make it happen before the critical 30-year mark due to the internal red tape. My God, I too thought that there was someone being helped out by a kindly old boss for a second there. I guess, though, it's even more satisfying to get a sweet deal out of your company and then make fun of your arch-enemy whose incompetence handed it to you. Haha. A colleague of mine was flown from his office in the field to headquarters under the pretense of a leadership meeting and fired immediately once he arrived. He was on a plane back home 2 hours later. The boss didn't feel like traveling, I guess. In 2008, my company had a huge riff of 100 or so people. The day that it happened was just terrible. I walked into the conference room and found the HR guy crying in the dark. 30 days later, they let him go as well. 2008 sucked. I'm just an IT guy, so I don't always know the whole story, but it feels bad locking someone's account on their PC and having them find out that way. Then, of course, moments later, an HR person shows up at their desk. I had a friend years ago, and she worked security at First Union Bank's main IT campus. She told me the way they let people go is they'd come in to badge in through the door, and their card would not work. Out came HR and security, where they'd escort the person to their desk to get their things and then walk them right out the door. She told me about 3 weeks after this practice started, one Saturday night at around 5 p.m., their ATM system crashed, and it took them all night to recover. She told me she thinks someone left them a going-away gift. I used to work in a warehouse, and one time an employee got seriously injured. His arm and leg was seriously messed up. The guy worked out a lot, so management pulled him into the office and began to speak to him. So, you hurt your arm at the gym and now you want to blame us. He had been injured when a pallet of heavy things literally tumbled over near him. If he didn't move right away, he could have easily gotten crushed. Management thought it was a scam. Do you know what insurance fraud is? Tell us the truth. We know everything. You can't lie to us. The guy was stunned. He wanted to use his health insurance, but the management wasn't hearing it. This continued for some time, a few hours at least. I guess someone overheard because 3 guys from the union showed up mad as hell, like completely livid. There was screaming, shouting, and then one mentioned that perhaps we should get the Department of Labor and the other insurance company involved. I guess that was enough to convince him. He let the employee use his insurance and things went on for a while. Apparently, this guy had a habit of doing this to everyone who was injured. Injury happens, then a day later, screaming in the office. He literally accused someone of working with a broken arm for 2 weeks before going to the hospital. I think someone either reported him or the union stepped in, because he's luckily disappeared. Allow me to post a happy story involving layoffs and HR. But first, a little background. Where I live, employers could give out temporary contracts for a total of 3 years. After that, they had to let you go or offer a permanent contract. So you work for somewhere for 3 years and a single second, it would equal a permanent contract. This girl was on her 3rd year, with all signs pointing towards a permanent. Her evaluations were through the roof. She was one of the more productive workers in the department, good rapport with the customers, co-workers liked her, and she loved working there. It should have been a done deal. However, 2 months before she hits 3 years, the company announces a downsizing. As part of this downsizing, all temporary workers will not have their contracts renewed or made permanent. Department head tries to argue with HR, citing everything I mentioned above, but they can't do anything. Downsizing like this is part of labor law as well as the CBA, and they literally can't make exceptions. But they can offer her transition help, like helping her find a new job. The girl doesn't want to do it, but she's convinced by the department head to do it anyway, so she brings her CV and the proof of all the training she's had and meets up with the HR rep. HR rep stops at one of her internships she did right before she came to her current job, and asks her a lot of questions about it. Then she asks her a lot of questions about how long she's been working for the company. Then he steps out for a good 10 minutes before returning with the head of the HR department. They ask her to again confirm her employment history. Turns out the company she'd interned at was taken over roughly a year before by the company she now worked for. Also, internships count as work experience, and when the takeover was finalized, the payroll was transferred on a one-to-one basis, including past experience. So officially, her employment with our company was not 2 years, 11 months, but 3 years, 2 months. As a result, her previously temporary contract was now permanent by law, and she wasn't laid off. Step 1. Owner or founder sells the company to a big corporation, makes a huge profit, and buggers off to the tropics. Step 2. New management starts to fire people, over 100, in the first 6 months. Step 3, new management then makes the place so miserable people start losing it and quitting, all within the second 6 months. And finally, the place gets so bad, employees threaten to unionize, the company says if they do, all jobs will be terminated and services exported to India. It's the worst crap I've ever seen. Screw big corporations. I've seen and heard about this happening so many times, and I don't know if it's just people so hopeless that they couldn't manage a glass of water at a desert market, or if it's just megacorps purposefully buying and then running down the competition to stay on top. I worked almost 100% on one of the major projects at my company. It was one of only a couple of whales that was keeping the lights on. This was during the major oil crash around 2014 or so. The project manager booked a long vacation way in advance, and the client decided at the last minute that all the work needed to be revisited. Not by our fault, just compliance with a new regulatory procedure. This was actually great news because it gave a lot of people work to do, which was pleasantly surprising news when layoffs are happening weekly, so we couldn't say no. A more senior co-worker stepped up and took over. Everything went great and we got the deadline in on time, but it took a lot of overtime on their part. They really came through. I and the other co-workers mentioned them by name during performance reviews to commend them. They were laid off a couple of weeks later. It wasn't announced. They stopped informing the staff of layoffs because apparently it was hurting morale. I was already planning on leaving to go to grad school, but I could have changed my mind up until that point. I pretty much just mentally checked out, ignored everyone, and counted down the days until I left. Just remember that if you work for a huge company, you owe them absolutely nothing beyond your scheduled hours. The people deciding your fate could be entire tiers above whatever low-level manager you answer to, and you'll probably never see their face or even know their name. You might get dropped on an impulse to make their spreadsheet numbers look better for their next meeting. My college roommate was a temp in an HR office for college credit. She came home one night absolutely disheveled, makeup smeared, heels in hand, just rough. In a nutshell, her supervisor made her participate in firing a woman for creating a hostile work environment. Seems cut and dry, right? Turns out the hostility in question was directed at a man the woman accused of inappropriate conduct with her daughter. The woman obviously went batcrap crazy, crying, begging to keep her job, the works. Told my roommate the entire story about how she'd dated the guy for dark side. Naturally, the mum threatened to kill the guy. The HR supervisor wasn't having it and had security escort the woman out. My roommate asked the supervisor if she thought the mum was telling the truth. The supervisor, cold as ice, "Probably. We hire some really suspicious people. She really shouldn't have left her daughter alone with him." That broke something in my roommate, and she dropped her business program 3.5 years in. I think she graduated with a degree in biology or something 2 years later. You can submit your own stories to be featured here on the channel. The story submission link is in the description below. And if you want to listen to some vibey music in the background, check out easymode, also linked below, and subscribe. Sears, Canada. Going through bankruptcy, many employees were laid off with no severance, while the executives were getting six-figure bonuses. Those bonuses could have covered many employees' severance. Made an employee come in at 6:30 for the morning rush hour, only to tell her to leave after 10 minutes because they were a bit overstaffed. I mean, at least give her 2 hours for her troubles. The warehouse I used to work for was really bad for this. They had a shuttle system that would run to a couple of towns 45 minutes to an hour away, and some people lived within 10 to 15 minutes. The perk of the shuttle was that it went to the low-income areas and picked up a ton of people who would otherwise not be able to get to work. Well, the shuttle only ran before and after shifts, not hourly like a bus system. Supposedly, the warehouse would only get the product numbers at like 5 a.m. when shifts started at 6. So when time rolled around, they'd tell us we were overstaffed and to go home. Their system was to break it down by which shifts and departments had left last time. Given that the shuttle people were the majority, they were most likely the ones sent home. After roll call and figuring out who was leaving, the shuttles will have gone and all the shuttle people were stuck in the cafeteria for the full 10-hour shift, unpaid, until the shuttles dropped off the 4 p.m. shift. It was a huge stink for the longest time. Finally, the warehouses shelled out the extra money to lengthen the shuttle contract times. I think it ultimately ran at the beginning, middle, and end of the shift. My Fortune 500 company was going through downsizing years back. Everyone knew their turn would be coming, so it wasn't the best of environments. One woman who had been with the company for 20 years was applying for jobs just to see what was out there, but really wanted to stay with the current company. She ended up getting an offer elsewhere. So she approached our manager at the time and told him the situation and asked for advice. The boss basically told her nothing was on the horizon but to do what was best for her. So she turns her notice in. The very next day, The rifts were announced, the entire department was being let go except for that one manager. Everyone gets a severance package except for the lady who put in notice the day before. She lost 40 weeks of pay. She was going to get 2 per year worked. The boss knew the rifts were coming. He could have advised her to wait a day in a roundabout way, so screw you, Derek. On the bright side, she had a new job right away while the rest of us took some time off and competed for the same open jobs in the area. Well, I hope that boss got ruthlessly canned with way less benefits than his time and service should have permitted later as well. I can't imagine being that callous with someone I'd worked with for so long. Although if the company was willing to lay off that many people, perhaps he'd have had the same treatment if his superiors found out he could have saved them 40 weeks of pay. I still say to do the right thing and go with your old colleagues. There was this guy who came to work for us about a year ago. This is hard manual labor, and the guy had quit slinging substances on the street to come and make an honest living to support his family. He was having trouble dealing with it at first, but he adjusted and ended up being one of the hardest workers on the floor. Always working those 12-hour shifts, staying busy the whole time. Anyway, he works with us for a good long while before his 19-year-old daughter dies suddenly in her sleep. He, of course, gets a few days off. They probably would have given him more time, but he really couldn't afford to miss any work. The guy held together so damn well while he was at work, man. You could tell for sure he was going through some stuff, but he stayed busy still. Well, the next week, I guess he decided he needed a little more time off, but he didn't call out and just stayed home for 2 days. After returning from that 2 days, he was immediately escorted out of the building and fired. I moved to another state and got a job at an alternative school for kids who had been kicked out of public school for emotional and behavioral issues. The company spent a few hundred hours training me, and I learned a lot more on the job. It was difficult at times, but I enjoyed the work and the people I worked with. After a few months, I felt comfortable in my role. Then, for some reason still unknown to me, the bosses wanted me gone. I was called into a meeting with 2 supervisors who said that we were now overstaffed, which is a lie. We had 3 vacancies, and that I had an exciting opportunity to move to another program. They wanted me to move to our sister program where you work one-on-one in a public school, which can suck if you have a kid who's really tough to work with. And in that program, they wanted me to be a sub or floater, so I could get a text at 5 a.m. telling me I had to go to a school an hour away to work with an emotionally unstable kid I'd never met before. So I thought about it the next day and told my supervisor that I wanted to stay where I was, but that I'd be flexible and go to the other program for a few months if they needed me there, or be a permanent one-on-one with a kid, just not a permanent floater. I didn't hear anything for a week, and then I got called into another meeting with both supervisors and the head director. The head director says that the other program would be better for my professional development, which is bullcrap, and then asks me to tell her 3 of my professional goals that I'm working on, clearly trying to catch me off guard. I make up something and then tell her my reasons for wanting to stay. I didn't hear anything for a couple more weeks, but the bosses are crappy and begin sending me emails for any mistakes I make that could easily have been said in person. For example, another staff and I were dealing with an escalated kid who'd already bit me, and I was tapping my foot while watching him. The director came up behind me and loudly said, "You need to stop doing that in front of the kid." Then she had one of my supervisors write me an email the next day telling me I had to be conscious of tapping my foot or drumming my fingers, which is true but doesn't require an email. Then I got called in to another meeting with the director and 2 supervisors who tell me that I'm getting moved to the other program. I gave my 2 weeks notice on the spot, which made my coworkers think I was badass, but didn't help the fact that I needed a new job. My director then still forced me to go to the other program for my last 2 weeks, so I didn't get the goodbye ceremony or anything at the alternative school and could do very little at the other program since they knew I wouldn't be there long. I ended up getting a job at a preschool with a much better boss, but it still frustrates me to think about the whole experience. I think the way I was fired by my last company was pretty crappy. I worked in marketing for a small company. They were having a lot of problems and there were crazy internal power struggles which led to my firing. Basically, crap just rolls downhill, I guess. The boss wasn't meeting sales goals because the salespeople that they'd hired and were buddies with couldn't sell water to someone dying of thirst and needed someone to blame. I went to the Christmas party and had the next 2 days off. The second day I had off, I got a generic email saying my services were no longer needed. The other 2 people in my department got the same email. Turns out everyone else at the party of about 20 people knew me and one of the other people, my supervisor, were going to get fired. The company's HR person, a real professional, had told a couple of others that we were going to get fired and word had spread. The third person who got fired was lined up to get my supervisor's job, but got drunk at the party and told the boss it was a mistake to fire us, so she ended up getting fired too. Looking back, not only was it crappy to fire us a week before Christmas, but also crappy to put us in a room of our co-workers who all knew that we were about to get fired. Not an HR worker, but last week 3 employees were fired in the company I work in. The lady in charge of terminating people was known in the company as Death, because when she called you into a room, stuff was gonna go down. She fired 2 people following our ridiculous protocol, which basically kicks people out and then someone else has to pick up their stuff from the desk and take it to them outside. We usually fire them first thing in the morning so they don't waste a whole day of work for a company they no longer work for. After doing those 2 terminations, her boss called her into that room and fired her as well. I think this is why you can lean towards being loyal to your coworkers rather than your company. Because even if you do exactly what they want for you, they won't have any loyalty to you and you could immediately be following them out the door. First-hand witness because it was me. I worked at a biotech startup for a year, saved them tons on in-house development of assay reagents and had nothing but positive feedback. One of my coworkers was let go due to budgetary concerns and was given a very generous severance. About a month later, my father passed away and I took a couple of days. When I come back, I'm asked to stay late for a few days, and then on a Tuesday I'm told I'm being furloughed until they get a grant approved, but would for sure be brought back on. Lost health insurance, no severance offered, and they'd already cancelled my ID badge and parking pass. Couldn't get back in to get my wallet and keys and whatnot, during which time my car was towed. Just remember, HR is not your friend. Their purpose is to protect the company, not the people. I was amazed to see how many employees think that going to HR to complain is like visiting your high school guidance counselor and getting help with your career. HR is there to keep the company out of employment lawsuits, and the second you leave their office, the manager is called in with a full report on what you said. It messes with the manager too, because it means they could be causing issues and now need a closer bit of monitoring. So, if you like your boss and had an issue you were too scared to raise and used HR instead, or didn't give a basically fair boss the chance to try and fix the situation before you complained, just know you put yourself on notice and them too. I worked for a company on contract, in HR if you believe it. It was a crappy company, so 6 weeks before the contract ended, I went to the boss and said that I was going to leave at the end of my contract. For the next 6 weeks, I was persona non grata in the HR department. I was removed from their group email list, I wasn't told about meetings, and they went on 2-day training outside the office and I wasn't told. I arrived at work to an empty HR department for 2 days. On my last day, I was saying goodbye to people around the office and my boss comes down and demands that I come to a meeting and walks away. After 6 weeks of basically no contact, I was wondering why. Someone in another department said that they'd planned a goodbye party for me. They treated me like crap for 6 weeks and then brought a gift, cake, and balloons. I said, F that, snuck up to my desk, got my coat, left the building and drove away. Apparently they'd sat there for an hour paging me throughout the building before they realized I'd left. Good thing was, I didn't need them there for a reference as a friend of mine owned his own company and gave me one saying I'd worked there for a year. What's something that sounds safe but is actually life-threatening? Anesthesia. I feel like people don't have enough respect for how complicated and dangerous it is to put people to sleep. I have patients all the time ask me to put them under for routine procedures that don't require sedation, and I always think to myself that you wouldn't be asking for that if you knew how much training and monitoring and intensive effort it takes to keep someone asleep safely without them stopping breathing. From my friend who works in government studying accidents, duck boats. At Branson, every other year it seemed that there was a new call to shut them down after an accident. Grain silos. People die every year because they explode with static electricity, and a lot of other ways too, including cave-ins, suffocation, burning, and other scary things. Yep, people don't realize how dangerous tiny particulate matter is. My mind was blown when I saw what design precautions went into designing a factory that made powdered coffee creamer. It's treated like nitroglycerin, and yet you put that crap in your coffee. Interacting with a giant anteater. Their claws can kill a jaguar without much issue. Riding a horse. Those motherfrickers will kill you in a heartbeat. A good friend of mine's an eventer and dressage rider. He doesn't know a single person who rides at his level who hasn't done it with multiple broken ribs. My wife always says that horses are like bicycles that can make bad decisions. Putting out an engine fire with a bucket full of water. Gasoline doesn't actually catch fire very easily. It takes some pretty specific conditions. You can usually extinguish a lit match by dunking it in a cup of gasoline. There's still a small chance it could ignite though, so please don't actually try this. However, when it does ignite, it doesn't burn, it explodes. So, If your engine is burning with a slow and steady fire, it's not the gasoline that's burning, it's the motor oil, and that makes it an oil fire, and you should never, ever add water to an oil fire. This is a great collection of smarty tidbits, all of which we're aware of, but have never considered, all contributing to why you should never douse a flaming engine block in water. I know all of these, but I can guarantee that up until I read this, dumping a bucket on a blazing car would have been my first instinct as well. Getting in a car without a headrest on your seat. It's not just a pillow for comfort, you know? Bison, like the wild, big cow-looking animals. I grew up around them and I see too many tourists in Yellowstone going to take a selfie with one. Those big mother effers will kill you without batting an eye. Telling your HR department how you really feel about your boss. Well, I don't know if this actually sounds safe, but trampolines. People think by putting the netting around them you won't get hurt. Think again. You're one awkward landing from lots of potentially life-changing injuries. I have personally gotten a spontaneous viewing of the inside of an adult foot and ankle because of a trampoline. Ugh. Safes. They'll bloody well crunch your fingers if you're not careful. Trampolines. The Canadian Pediatric Society warns against buying them at all for use by kids and teens. My dad literally made my friends' parents sign waivers before the friends were allowed to be on our trampoline. My dad did this too. A lot of people thought he was crazy, but it always seemed prudent considering how lawsuit-happy the US is. Then there was our experience in a foreign country where a neighbor girl, who was maybe 8 years old, broke her arm falling off our trampoline, and her parents marched her over after getting back from having a cast put on her arm, and made her apologize for falling off our trampoline. Then the parents apologized profusely as well, as if their daughter had, in her clumsiness and misfortune, shamed their entire family and all their ancestors. Once my dad recovered from shock, he sent her flowers and a get-well-soon card. Dryer lint. Clear your dryer vents, people. About a month ago, I hired one of those "we clean out the dryer vent lines" people. Super nice guy, really knew what he was talking about. So he tells me it'll be $70, and I give the go-ahead because I'm not in the mood to climb on the roof. Our vents go up and out, and I'd have no idea what I was doing anyway. So he gets to work, super frickin' clean, wasn't yelling on his phone the whole time, takes about an hour, and then I pay the guy. He tells me then that his vacuum, a big shop vac, clogged a couple of times and he was sorry for the delay. There was so much lint blocking the vent, it clogged a shop vac multiple times. It was then I realized the previous owner had never cleaned the vents. On the plus side, the dryer works way better now and the house doesn't smell like lint after drying clothing. Oh, and my crap didn't burn down in the middle of the night, killing me and my family, so that's a plus. Whenever I'm camping and I need to absolutely start a fire with a single spark, I use dryer lint. That stuff is supremely, dangerously flammable. Farming. Everyone thinks about the bucolic pastures, pretty red barns, and cute little critters running around, but farming is the 6th most dangerous occupation in the United States, higher than law enforcement, firefighters, power line workers, and iron workers. Most of the farming deaths involve accidents with machinery, but grain storage deaths are pretty high as well. If a farmer falls into, say, a bin of canola, he sinks to the bottom and suffocates fairly quickly, as well as the unfortunate ones that fall into pig manure pits and drown in liquid crap. Farm animals also kill a lot of farmers too because a 180-pound man doesn't have good odds going up against a 12,000-pound cow. Plus the fact that no one talks about is the mental health-related deaths. Farming is incredibly stressful, and self-deletion in the farming community is rising steadily. One of the worst things is how isolating a lot of the work can feel, especially outside of the harvests, and just how isolated everything is in general. Really, it makes it hard to react during any sort of emergency. I mean, my grandpa died at 61 from an otherwise treatable heart problem because it took 40 minutes just for an ambulance to get all the way out to him. Farming's also a top 10 profession for deciding you don't want to be alive anymore and acting on it. Not only is it often isolating, but you also have the pressures of being a small business owner, along with what's often the pressure of generations of family expectation. It's bad enough having a small social circle or having to sell your business, but it's worse when you have that and also you're talking about selling something that's been in your family for 100 years. These aren't issues that I'm personally facing, but they're common in the AG industry. Yes, it's an industry just like any other field of work. Mouthing off to a stranger. You never know how crazy they might be, what they're going through, or if they have a weapon. Just bite your tongue. Cleaning a cat's litter box with bleach. Don't mix ammonia and bleach, you'll be committing a war crime. The main thing to remember is never mix bleach with anything besides water. If I'm honest, fair rides. You'd think it'd be safe. It's surrounded by a lot of people, so if anything were to happen, help would be there straight away. And there's all these safety precautions. But the amount of things that have gone wrong way too often is scary. When I was a teenager, I got stuck on Witch's Wheel at a fair. It shorted out and got stuck on the on position. It ran for about half an hour, maybe 45 minutes before they figured out what was wrong and got it to stop. It ran at full tilt at a 45-degree angle for the entire time. I've never been sicker in my life. My friends took me home and I couldn't walk to my front door. I lay in the backyard chucking up. My mother yelled at me because she thought it was because I was drunk, but my friends explained what happened. I'll never ride another spinny ride ever again. Screw that. Gonna be honest, this is probably never going to stop the narrator from getting on a fair ride. The chances of being on the one time where it crashes are so incredibly small, especially at a fair that undergoes regular inspections. And good luck trying to tell your kids not to get on them. I feel like all you can really do is metaphorically and literally sit back and enjoy the ride. Boating. I'm a boat mechanic, but I didn't have much boating experience before I started working on them, and I was pretty caught off guard to discover how dangerous it can be. Everyone thinks of boating as this idyllic family activity, and it usually is, but a staggering amount of crap can go wrong on the water and leave you stranded or worse. There are submerged objects like rock formations and logs that can cause you to get ejected or sink your boat. It's fairly easy to forget a plug and sink your boat. That happens frequently. Most boat owners have no idea how to operate a boat safely or even competently. It's trickier than you might think. It takes some experience and technique. Also, heavy drinking among boaters is rampant. People often don't secure their trailer correctly to the tow vehicle, not latched, wrong ball size hitch, unsecured or improperly secured chains, stuff like that. People don't service their trailers, wheels fall off from a lack of grease. I'd conservatively estimate that 30% of trailer brakes just don't work, and the percentage goes up logarithmically with the age of the trailer. Give boat trailers a wide berth on the freeway. Often people don't follow basic safety like life jackets and kill lanyards. You can hit a big wake or wave and get knocked away from the controls, and your boat is now a self-guided missile. If you're swimming behind a running boat, you can pass out from the fumes and drown. You can get chopped to bits by the propeller. You can get hit by a boat being driven by a drunk, inexperienced, or incompetent person. A fuel leak can cause a buildup of fumes in the bilge that gets ignited by engine electronics. The list goes on and on. Growing up, we had a boat. One time we were out with some friends. My dad couldn't come this time. We were prepping for the next skier and wakeboarder when my mom noticed something was wrong. She asked my brother and I to check something, and when we did, she definitely got a whole lot more concerned. The friends were oblivious to any troubles and asked who was next. My mom said, "No one, because we're sinking." We promptly raced back to the dock where we put the boat on the trailer as fast as we could. Turns out we forgot the drain plug and we were taking on water. I still remember that over 20 years later. You can submit your own stories to be featured here on the channel. The story submission link is in the description below. And if you want to listen to some vibey music in the background, check out easymode, also linked below, and subscribe. Four-wheelers. So many injuries and deaths from people who don't respect what they can do and just how easy they are to topple. My sister passed some years back at 19 years old on a four-wheeler she had just purchased. She was with friends who were also riding their own. She had a girlfriend on the back of hers who was a little heavy-set. In order to get to the area, they had to cross a small drainage ditch, maybe 4 or 5 feet from the bank to the bottom of it. It was completely dry. She attempted to go up it, straight ahead with the girl on the back. And my understanding is that when she gassed it, the front tires left the ground, flipping it over backwards on top of them. The passenger was thrown to the side, but my sister held on, probably out of shock, and the weight of the entire thing came down on her head via the handlebars, pinching her between that and the concrete. By the time any help arrived, she was already gone. If you take anything from this story or the hundreds of others that you're likely to read about in your life, wear a damn helmet. Anything can happen in the blink of an eye. Walking up or down stairs. Literally every time I trip a little going down the stairs, I think to myself, in another dimension, that was how I died. Falling down stairs is scary though. Using a dull knife rather than a sharp one. That applies to razors as well in my experience. Try using the same blade for over a year? Well, too bad, because hairs either aren't coming off or your entire face is. My rule of thumb is that whenever I'm on the highway and I see a trailer or some oversized cargo tied to a flatbed or latched to a truck, think of the stupidest failure of a human being you've ever met. Now imagine that person is the one who secured that cargo to the vehicle. Drive accordingly. Sleeping. Many people have sleep apnea who just aren't overweight, old, they smoke, or unhealthy. Snoring is the big indicator. You stop breathing dozens of times an hour through the night until your body responds by waking you up and repeats it again. Not only does it slowly starve your brain of oxygen and put tremendous strain on your heart over the years, but it can cause such excessive drowsiness and sleep deprivation you can fall asleep while driving. If your partner says you snore a lot or you're always tired despite getting regular sleep, get it checked out. Regular being sleepy when driving isn't normal, nor is always falling asleep when you sit and watch TV, read, or just relax for a few minutes. I have severe sleep apnea and snored like crazy since I was a child and had several inconclusive sleep studies. I wasn't diagnosed until I was 20 and went to the dentist. They put me on laughing gas and I promptly fell asleep. The second I woke up, my dentist looked me dead in the eye and told me, "If you don't get treatment for your sleep apnea, you'll be dead by 30. After having a sleep study, I found out I was having 55 interruptions, periods of 10 seconds or more without breathing, per hour, with my average interruption lasting 27 seconds. I was exhausted all the time and my quality of life was terrible. Now I have the energy to do the things I love doing. I'm very thankful that I fell asleep in that dentist's chair." Don't put up your feet on the dashboard of a car when you're riding in the front seat. It doesn't matter if you're wearing a seatbelt, your kneecaps are going to go through your skull if you get into an accident. I used to do that all the time when I was younger, now I want to scream every time I see it. Holding your breath while scuba diving. If you ascend from depth with your airways closed while breathing compressed air, you're at extreme risk of rupturing a lung, damaging your alveoli, or suffering from other lung overexpansion injuries. This is because when you take a breath under significant external pressure, the air you breathe in is much more dense, and so your lungs can get more of it per breath. But as the pressure acting on you lessens, the air in your lungs expands. And if your airways aren't open, your lungs will be damaged from the overpressure. It's an easily avoidable risk, but if ignored, the consequences are often deadly or at least permanently damaging. Making pottery. Let me explain. The colors are all from metals, and except for iron, they're all toxic to some degree. The best glazes set off a Geiger counter. Silicosis, emphysema, and cancer are occupational hazards from the dust. The ingredient that makes pottery glazes dishwasher safe is wollastonite, which is actually more dangerous than asbestos. You're dealing with something that can make an airtight seal, contains water, and is going to be heated. Pottery exploding in the firing process is a common problem. Speaking of firing, we're talking high temperatures. You can light a cigarette by tapping the tip on the outside of the kiln while it's running. That's already assuming you're using insulating bricks. Toxic gases can come from the pottery during firing, and most kilns are indoors. Firing with gas or wood burners can pose a carbon monoxide hazard. All of the bending over and physical work can lead to arthritis. Making and firing pottery improperly can poison the end user. Storage of toxic and radioactive and carcinogenic materials is usually subpar. Moderately old buildings. I became an asbestos inspector for my job, and let me tell you, the more you find out about asbestos and what we put it in, the less time you want to spend in any structure built prior to the mid-80s. And that's just asbestos. Not even going to go into the other hazardous building materials like lead. Asbestos was truly an almost miraculous building material for its time. It's cheap to acquire, and adding it to almost any construction material made that material better at its job. It's also insidiously easy to get complacent around it. Unless you're breathing insane amounts of it, you wouldn't know it's there unless you had that knowledge beforehand. It doesn't smell, you won't feel queasy or nauseous. It just seems like normal dust, with the caveat that if you breathe too much or are just unlucky, there's a chance that the latter half of your life will be spent in absolute misery if one of the severe medical conditions associated with asbestos doesn't just kill you within a few years of showing symptoms. The human race can always rely on the universe to humble us whenever we discover one of these miracle solutions like asbestos that seems able to do everything. There'll be more to come too. So I'm looking forward to finding out that all of our healthy plant protein products eventually turn us into raving mad cannibals or something like that. Driving. Seriously. A news story near me lately shook me, even though I know it's not the first time it had happened. But a driver swerved into oncoming traffic and got into a head-on accident. There was only one guy in either car, but they both died. It makes me sick that you can do everything right while driving and just get killed by someone else at any time. Flushable wipes. They can actually clump together into big balls that clog your drain or worse, cause issues for the town plumbing way down the line. We had a lift station cleaned out. In the bottom of the 30-foot silo there was a cake made of wipes and other sanitary products. This cake was so dense that a person could stand on it. This was obstructing the pumps at the bottom of the silos, which, in a worst-case scenario, would overflow into the adjacent river. Stop flushing stupid stuff down the frickin' toilet. People with anxiety should really not be listening to this video. Yeah, thanks, but I'm already in too deep. The safety dance. But don't let me dissuade you. You can dance if you want to. You can also leave your friends behind. Leaving the house and staying in the house. Pregnancy. A woman's body is designed to perform this function, and yet you and the thing you're growing inside of you can die or kill you. Both my first son and I wouldn't have lived if it wasn't for medicine and C-sections. Driving. Doing 100 down the freeway in a metal can powered by a highly flammable combustion liquid, and motherfrickers can still have the nerve to cut you off. All of these are really reminding me of the Lonely Island song, YOLO. Garage door springs. I remember there was a conversation about what's the most dangerous DIY product you could attempt yourself, and garage door springs were the number one, followed by using a chainsaw. Tons of pros on there, and everyone agreed. I view my garage door spring with caution now. It's a coiled killer. Earbuds. They'll put you at risk of early onset hearing loss. The way your 80-year-old grandpa yells, "What did you say?" at 150 decibels is going to be us at 40 because we can't stop blasting Sicko Mode by Travis Scott at full volume straight into our ears. Retractable dog leashes that don't give you that much control and can potentially cause serious injuries to you or your dog. The eyes of potatoes, if they've sprouted any green, can be poisonous. Potatoes are members of the nightshade family, and they're the most common cause of solanine poisoning in humans. Their green stuff can cause lesser versions of all the same symptoms of the nightshade family, including paralysis of the central nervous system, and can even cause death. Use that weird thing on your peeler to gouge out those eyes. Opening up a CRT monitor or TV. Those old TVs contain a capacitor that can hold a lethal charge even after being unplugged for about a month. I've never experienced the shock, but when I was studying the CompTIA A+ certificate manual, basically the whole chapter on monitor repairs summed up to hire someone who knows what they're doing or you will be electrocuted. Alcohol. What's messed up about alcoholism, among other things, is how socially acceptable it is to get rat-faced every night. So as long as you're holding down a job and not getting multiple DUIs, a lot of people act like it's no big deal. Plus there's all those jokes you see from parents about mummy needs her wine while holding up those big novelty glasses. Hoda and Kathy Lee used to drink on the Today Show every morning at like 10 a.m. Some workplaces have mandatory company outings that really just entail going to a bar and trying to talk about anything besides work. I'm an alcoholic and it doesn't bother me to be around others drinking, but for some it can make sobriety really difficult. Living with your parents. I had to move back in for various reasons and my mental health and well-being are declining fast. Replacing or adjusting garage door springs. This one doesn't sound perfectly safe, I admit, but the ratio of perceived safety to actual holy crap this can end super badly is definitely there. Being a shop owner in Los Angeles. Invading Russia in the winter. Acetaminophen or Tylenol. Great, but the dose makes the poison, especially dangerous for hard drinkers and alcoholics. Breaking wind after eating Taco Bell. As someone who works in emergency medical services, you'd be surprised by the amount of people who think it's safer to not wear a seatbelt than to wear one. Biking in car-friendly cities. Opening a box with a box cutter. Someone I know works at a place where they have a "It's been this many days since our last accident" sign, and after about 184 days with no accidents, they had to change it to 0 days because someone was careless with a box cutter. I say this all the time, but pressure washing. Knew a guy in college with a younger brother he loved to pick on, send him to the hospital after hydroblasting him with 400 psi. Pressure washers can be commonly found and started by kids, and I honestly don't know why people don't recognize how dangerous they are. When you subscribe, make sure to hit the bell to turn on notifications. Put the playlist on in the background to finish listening to all the stories, or if you want some vibey music to put on in the background, check out easymode. If you like Am I the Genius, give Am I the Jerk a shot. Everything linked in the description.